existing in India by a handful of states, now being seriously taken up by other states too. And this particular development has got far-reaching implications. And the very idea of summarizing the labor legislation in India was on the anvil. They were trying to make it into 4 major codes. Uh, Dr. Thomas Isaac, the chairman of the governing body of Gulati Institute, very kindly suggested that the Gulati Institute should provide a forum to debate these things, generate a national debate around these issues, and to see one way or the other whether it can lead to a consensus on the ground reality. What should be the focus of our regulatory concerns? Who should come under the radar? And what should be the objective of state policy? Is there a common set of programs that all partners in the world of work can agree on? And it was suggested that we should bring together the trade unions, the employers, and the academic scholars who have been studying the situation for years together. Dr. Isaac also had this idea to bring in the ILO, but then ILO is not necessarily the kind of a neutral player in a nation, in a committee of nation states. So we just avoided the ILO, but some of the very distinguished senior professionals of the ILO, Jerry Rogers in particular, agreed to come in. That apart, this particular session is devoted to an analysis of the ongoing changes in India's labor market. We have assembled the best array of talents available in India who have analyzed, who have commented, who have prescribed solutions to the ongoing problems. And we have as many as 16 of them. And we are trying to summarize the discussions conclude the discussions in a span of 3 hours. Hopefully, we will be able to give everyone 10 minutes. And thereon, if there is time, we will be able to take questions and queries from people taking part in the webinar. And among the scholars we have assembled, we have got Amit Bhaduri, the leading light of the profession at a time when I started joining the crowd. And I would still say the most eminent macro theory specialist which India has had for a long time. He has agreed to come in. And then there is Dr. Jerry Rogers, who was effectively my boss in the ILO, had years of interaction with him. But then Jerry is known for his empathy and concern for the workers of India. He worked on the Indian labor market for, I must say, a longer period of time than any labor economist in India. And therefore, it's a privilege to have Jerry along with us. And there is Professor Kannan, KP Kannan, my colleague, former colleague from the Center for Development Studies. Again, one of those exceptionally talented labor market analysts who has written extensively, has served in committees of the government, prescribing policies. Kannan too has agreed to come in again, dealing with extremely sensitive issues that are relevant to the times, the prospects of national rural employment creation programs for alleviating poverty and creating employment opportunities. There we have next in that line. I'm sorry, I'm just very briefly going through the list of people who will be speaking. There is Ravi Srivastava, a long time, a doyen of labor economics, a member of the Indian, prominent member of, leader of the Indian Society of Labor Economics, taught in Jawaharlal Nehru University, currently director of the Institute of Human Development. Ravi has agreed to come in to speak to us about the social security interests of workers with special reference to those in the unorganized sector. Thereon we go to Professor Atul Sood of the Center for Study of Regional Development, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Atul's contribution is about analyzing the recent labor law changes. He tried to explain the economics and politics of undoing the labor regulations of India. That's what he's going to talk about. Then we have a long-term specialist of labor laws in India, Professor Prabhu Mahapatra, started his career in the National Labor Institute, knowledgeable on the evolution of industrial relations in India. He has agreed to come in to speak to us very briefly about the history of labor legislation in India and the kind of predicament it is going through. And then we have Advocate Ramapriya Gopalakrishnan, more an academic scholar than a practicing lawyer, talking about the legality of the recent changes in Indian labor regulations. Ramapriya has been associated with the ILO, extremely knowledgeable about the conventions of the ILO. Therefore, it'll be a pleasure listening to her. And then we have a representative of the ILO speaking to us about the classic turf of the ILO, the rights of workers, the fundamental principles and rights at work, the major conventions that came into being through the mediation of the ILO, that is the Convention 98, the Convention on the Freedom of Association and the right to collective bargaining, how that's being put to stress in difficult times. And there is Insaf Nizam, who is the fundamental rights specialist, freedom of association specialist in the Delhi office of the International Labour Organization. And there we come to Professor Shyam Sundar, who has been writing on industrial relations for as long as I have known him, extremely knowledgeable about the employment situation, about the labor relations situation, currently professor of industrial relations in the Xavier Relation and a prominent management institute, Jamshedpur. Shyam has been extremely helpful to us in organizing this meeting, and I welcome him. And there we have Professor Archana Prasad from the Jawaharlal Nehru University, the concern about the concerns of women workers in the changing environment. Professor Archana has agreed to speak about. And we have Bharat Bhushan, prominent journalist of the country, the first to write about the pandemic of poverty that is spreading in the subcontinent, following the massive trudging back of migrant workers. Bharat is incisive in his analysis and extremely powerful in his writing. And it was nice of him to have come in, and I greatly welcome him because we all share a common grief today, because his teacher, all of us, our great associate in the Center for Development Studies, Professor Vaidyanathan, passed away only day before yesterday. And welcome to Bharat. And there is another CDS alumni, Professor Jimol Unni, again prominent figure, occupying very many important positions, always a specialist on the unorganized sector, always hearing the concerns of women workers. Jimol is also a listed speaker here. She was already there in the morning sessions. And then we have Professor Dr. Amit Basole from the Asim Premji Institute, extremely knowledgeable on the current labor law debate. Again, he's going to put it in perspective. And we have Professor R. Nagaraj, an old-time colleague, again from the Center for Development Studies, moved places, went over to the Indira Gandhi Institute of Development Research, and I believe Nagaraj is coming back to Trivandrum. And that would be really welcome, and he's going to speak to us about trends in employment in the organized sector. And along with him, there is Dr. Radhika Kapoor of the Indian Council of Research on International Economic Relations based in Delhi. She has been writing extensively about the employment situation, and Radhika's focus will be on the unorganized sector workers or informal sector employment. And finally, we have Dr. Anna Mitra Roy Chaudhary of the Jawaharlal Nehru University, writing again, airing the concerns, bringing these issues to the notice of the public. Dr. Roy Chaudhary will focus on the concerns of contract labor and how we are trying to address them and how we are trying to undo the legacy of protectionist labor legislation in the country. So without taking more time, let me give the floor to the panelists. First, let me say there is going to be Amit Baduri. Amit, belonging to a generation slightly older than mine, mentioned that he wouldn't be able to handle the problem of a web gathering. Therefore, we got a video clip from him. And we start with Amit, who is bringing in the interrelationship between informal and formal labor and the importance of labor regulations. His statement is extremely poignant. It's important we start listening to him first. Thank you. Presentation on the kind of policies that are required at this juncture in India. Now, let me come to the next speaker, Dr. Jerry Rogers. He's speaking to us from Geneva. Thank you, Jerry, for coming in. Jerry.
Thank you, Jose. Can you hear me okay? Okay, am I?
You are audible. Please, go ahead.
Okay.
Except speak closer to the loudspeaker.
Well, that's a bit difficult because it's right here. Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Dr. Jose and colleagues at the Gulati Institute for the invitation to participate in this webinar. Very pleased to be included in this distinguished group of speakers. And after a discussion with Dr. Jose, I'm going to talk about basic income and how it relates to the goal of better jobs. Now, many people see in the coronavirus crisis the opportunity for structural transformation. And it's certainly true that crisis can result in radical change. The most obvious example in the last century is what happened after the Second World War, providing the impetus for decolonization and a social market economy in Europe. But what actually happens after a crisis depends both on the depth of the crisis and how it interacts with the political economy. The global financial crisis of 2008-9 had very little impact on the politics of financial globalization. So will the coronavirus crisis be different? Well, certainly many people think that this is an opportunity to advance their agendas. Some think we can end up with a more sustainable world and a reduction in inequality. Some people are hoping to end the power of global finance or to disengage with globalization. Some are hoping to promote decentralization to local communities. And of course, in India and elsewhere, there are groups that are trying to use the coronavirus crisis as a means to deregulate the labor market. Now, in this wide agenda, the idea of universal basic income has attracted a lot of attention. And during the crisis itself, many countries have put in place large and unconditional income transfers to offset the massive impact of economic contraction and job loss. And this looks very much like a basic income policy, a guarantee that all citizens should receive an income adequate to cover their basic living costs. Now, of course, it's temporary. It's an exceptional measure to deal with an exceptional situation, and the cost is huge if it covers everybody. But the advocates of basic income argue that this demonstrates that they were right, and that if a universal basic income had been in place, this would have offset many of the adverse effects of the crisis. So supporters of this idea see it as a way to realize the right of all citizens to a decent life, a way to give people freedom to be creatively use their time without the obligation of drudgery and work, a way to compensate an increasingly jobless economy, a route to gender equality, an instrument to eliminate poverty. And that all sounds good. But there are others in this debate as well, and libertarians see basic income as a way to reduce the presence of the state. It's a way to streamline and reduce social security, and it's a way to free capitalists of minimum wages and other labour market regulation. So basic income is a right-wing agenda as well. Now, despite the attractions of basic income, there are some serious problems with this idea. And one lies in the word basic, which assumes that there's some sort of income level which would be enough. But everybody aspires to more. And basic income can't just maintain people in poverty, it has to sustain a decent life. And then the question of cost raises its ugly head. If a basic income is set low and replaces all existing social security, as libertarians would argue, the net cost might be manageable, provided the transfer is recovered from progressive income taxation. You know, most OECD countries put 10 to 20% of GDP into social security and social protection. That might be enough. Of course, in India, that would require already a huge increase in social spending, but it might be enough. But any basic income that's higher than the bare minimum would rapidly become an intolerable charge on the state. A more effective social security system could be built with far less resources. In India, just making the PDS universal would be a huge step forward, much easier to implement. But there's a more fundamental difficulty, and it's one which is more directly related to the debate in this webinar on labour regulation, which is that basic income is a strategy for redistribution without a strategy for production. Existing social security systems are intended to complement the labour market, not to replace it. And they're built on the assumption that most citizens earn an income from employment, as long as employment is available. And without this assumption, and without the need to work, one has to ask the fundamental question of where the basic income is going to come from. In other words, how do you sustain a level of economic activity which can support this transfer of income? That's the problem. This problem is why Tony Atkinson, one of the gurus of the academic world concerned with inequality, why he favoured a participation income rather than a citizen income, one that's conditional on participation in productive work or other socially endorsed activity, at least within the prime working age groups. Our societies and economies are still based on the principle that we engage in productive work. Now, that's in some sense the mirror image of the other common argument, which is that basic income is needed because people are increasingly being excluded from the labour market by technological change. Now, that argument can be contested, of course, but let's just take it at its face value. If production is to be maintained with declining employment, we need investment in capital-intensive manufacturing and capital labour substitution in services. And that will only occur in a capitalist economy, and we all live in capitalist economies, if this investment generates sufficient profit. Then these production activities will certainly require some highly skilled workers who will have to be paid well to attract them into the labour force. And that suggests the prospect, ultimately, of a society, to simplify, with three classes: capitalists or capital owners living off the returns from their investment, a class of skilled and well-paid workers in various productive occupations, and those who live on their basic income, perhaps combined with occasional low-paid or casual work. That may or may not be very different or better than what we have at the moment, but it doesn't sound terribly desirable. And in fact, regardless of whether or not growth is jobless, it's not at all clear what will happen to the labour market if a universal basic income were applied. there's a serious risk that basic income would distract effort from extending worker protection and providing effective employment security, which require action in the production system and in the design of labour market regulation. So there's a fundamental problem here. Universal basic income may be desirable in itself, but what if it undermines efforts to raise the quality and productivity of work and employment, and in particular is likely to reduce the political pressure to deal with inadequate labour market situations? And yet most labour market intervention is not about wages and incomes, but about conditions of work, security, health in the workplace, respect for rights at work, ability to develop and apply skills. Sometimes argued that basic income would actually empower workers, would give them the ability to refuse inadequate work or inadequate working conditions. But it's just as likely that we would end up with a highly flexible labour market as the availability of basic income reduces the pressure on employers to provide decent jobs and leaves a large fraction of the workforce living off basic income, supplemented by occasional casual work. Case for basic income is much easier to make for groups outside the main working ages, for children, perhaps young people in full-time education and training, and older people. Universal minimum pensions are an obvious benefit in any society, but that's much more like conventional social security. Just one more important point, which is that the notion of universal basic income does nothing to deal with the distribution of wealth. And in some ways, the notion of basic wealth is more attractive than basic income. A large proportion of individuals have no significant wealth, and that's a major source of insecurity. And it's been suggested that all citizens should be given at birth or at adulthood a share in national wealth financed by a tax on assets or inheritance. And that could be done in a way to help people invest in developing their capabilities in the labour market. It's much less likely to have an adverse effect on the labour market than a basic income. So to sum up, in my view, the idea of a universal basic income is attractive, but it's unlikely to give a better result in terms of reduction in poverty, insecurity, and inequality than improvements to existing social security and food distribution systems. And it's certainly not a substitute for adequate labour market regulation aimed at better jobs. If any transformation is needed, and we can certainly argue that transformation is needed, it should be focused on ensuring incomes through access for all to productive and decent employment. And that's where the need for fresh thinking and new methods is greatest. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jerry Rogers. These points coming from somebody who was associated with the very evolution of the concept of basic needs approach and its culmination as the universal basic income approach. I mean, it's great to listen, and I understand your misgivings about making it a throwaway program or making it a helicopter money-oriented program. That's far from our intention. I think the idea is to debate a marriage of these two concerns, decent work and a universal basic income. It should be possible to generate the kind of debate with inputs from people like you and arrive at a concrete set of programs that can provide both. Great listening to you. Now let me come to Kannan, again very much associated with the kind of issues Jerry raised, but more passionately from the point of view of employment creation, ventures in India, and how on earth are we going to finance them? And if we don't finance them, what's going to happen to the poor? Kannan will speak, I suppose, I guess that's his favorite subject.
Can you hear me? Yes. Hello?
Yes, we can hear you. Please.
Thank you, George. And let me greet all my friends in the panel and also to the wider audience. Well, the topic that the GIF suggested that I should speak on is NREG and consequence to poverty reduction. having heard my two previous speakers, let me slightly change that into the potential of the National Rural Employment Scheme to strengthen the unorganized sector workers.
Yeah, Kannan,
Yes,
there is some problem with your audio. Can you speak into the mic perhaps? That might help. Yeah.
I am speaking to the mic, but can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Hear you, go ahead.
Yes, we can.
Can you hear me?
Kannan, now we can hear you, but yeah, now it's better. Yes.
I don't know what's the problem, but let me just come closer to the computer. I'll try my best. What I'm saying is I'm trying to relate the National Rural Employment Scheme as an example for strengthening the condition of work and life of the unorganized sectors that will have a spillover effect on the formal sector. This is what Professor Amit Badri said, that whatever intervention that you do in the informal sector, in terms of trying to raise the wages or the floor wages and work conditions, that will have a positive influence on the formal sector because of their increased ability to bargain. The other way doesn't happen, he said, because if you have a demand for higher wage in the formal sector, what we have seen, and as we theorized, that the work will go to the subcontracting route to the less and less secure workers who are there in the unorganized sector. So the linkage between a program like the National Rural Employment Guarantee is its potential to provide both employment when needed and a certain amount of income through the payment of wages. Now, at the moment, the scheme is a half, what I often call a half-hearted, half initiative, because the right given to employment rights is a half right because it is applicable only for 100 days in a year for the family and not to the individual. Secondly, the wage prescribed, the recommended national minimum wage, is actually exactly half of the required national minimum wage as given by an expert committee recently. So there is a deficit both in terms of quantity of employment as well as the wages paid. If there is a unified fight cutting across all trade unions, then my appeal to national trade unions is to take a much more proactive, play a much more proactive role in respect of the workers in the unorganized sector. So if they, of course they do sometimes, but it needs to be more in a sustained and well articulated way. So an increase in the minimum wages will then immediately reflect as an increase in the wages paid to the workers in the rural employment guarantee. And if any battle won to increase the cap on employment quantity will also increase their income. So increased quantity of employment and increased minimum wages will result in a better income that will result in a reduced distress migration from rural areas to urban areas. So these three factors together will have a positive influence in the urban economy, so insofar as the urban labor market is concerned, in terms of their ability to defend their higher wages, if at all, or to ask for increased floor wage in the urban economy. Now, the conditions of work part is much more difficult, but the Employment Guarantee Act provides for certain minimum conditions. Of course, it is meant for 8 hours of work. It doesn't come under the factories law. But in a situation when a state government suspends the central law of the Factories Act of 1948, dispensing between hours of work, then it will willy-nilly affect the rural employment scheme as well, or so I fear. So that is something to be fought through by the national trade unions, irrespective of which sector they represent. There is provision for training and skill formation in the NREG fund. There is provision for child care at the workplace. There is provision for drinking water. Some of the minimum things which were earlier incorporated in the Factories Act. I do not know what is going to happen. The sum and substance of a unified fight for the entire class of organized workers on basic issues that are foundational to the society and economy and the laboring class as a whole, also then result in reducing working poverty, the laboring poor condition. They work, but they continue to be poor. That will be. In that sense, I think the gap between the informal sector and the formal sector could get reduced. And if we have a unified fight, the possibility will be much more. Although I want to recall what Professor Badri said, that the state is not only not neutral, it is highly biased in favor of private corporate capital, and that too of a certain regional variety. So we are in a very tight situation as far as the majority of the working people in this country is concerned. But I think that calls for much more unified solutions for mobilization and organization, forgetting about their very many differences which often come in the way of such unified study. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Kannan, for amazing clarity in expressing the concerns of the day, how to increase the income, wage income of the lowest layers of the society, and what could possibly be done about it, ways and means of doing that, the role of the National Rural Employment Guarantee Program. Thank you very much for coming in. And let me make an announcement for all the distinguished academics here. We will be making use of your presentations to prepare typed scripts, transcripts, and we will send them back to you. Grateful if you can go through them, embellish them if it is required, send them back to us so that they could be eventually published by the Gulati Institute of Finance and Taxation. And next, let me invite Ravi Srivastava from the Institute of Human Development, who would certainly bring before us the concerns of improving the social security of people, again, at the lower end of the labor market. Ravi, if you are there.
Thank you, Professor Jose, and thank you, Professor Joseph, for inviting me to this webinar and to speak on these issues. You know, every lesson that we have from the lockdown points us to in the direction that we should be working for greater social security, improved working conditions, and greater formalization of labor. But in the past few weeks, we have seen a great backlash from pushing all laws in the opposite direction. Since I am to focus on social security, I'm going to divide this brief 10-minute presentation into 3 parts. The first is I'll as a member of the NUS, where we had made a specific proposal, and I wish to reiterate that on social media, who spoke before me was centrally responsible for working on these proposals, and as a commission, then we developed and put them forward before the then government and Prime Minister. Our proposals on social security were based on one premise. Every worker. It had 5 main elements.
Ravi. Dr. Srivastava, can you hear us? It's written there was a bandwidth problem. Therefore, may I suggest that we resume his presentation when Dr. Srivastava gets back. Can I call in Dr. Professor Atul Sood to come in his place? It's not really. Dr. Atul Sood,
Yeah.
can you hear me? Can we hand over the floor? Can you speak?
Sir, Atul Sood just got disconnected. Yeah, he came back. He came back.
Thank you, Professor Joseph and Professor Jose.
We have a problem. We can't hear you. Have you unmuted yourself? No. Hello. We have a problem hearing you. You are not audible.
Mute myself.
Okay.
Can you
Please
hear
go
me?
ahead. Please go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you for asking me to come and speak, Professor Joseph and Professor Jose. I wanted to make 2 points in this deliberations that we've been having since the morning. One, I wanted to make the point that there is a strong disconnect between the rationale, the changes that are being proposed in the labor laws, and the rationale that is being articulated to make these changes. And since there is this strong disconnect between the rationale and the changes that are being made, the challenge for us is to really explain for all of us who want to argue and look at the world on behalf of labor, of how we explain the state in terms of the actions it's unleashing, and what kind of opportunity it provides to us to bring greater solidarities amongst labor as a result of these changes. So that's the 2 key points that I want to make. In order to look at the connection between the rationale and the changes, let me quickly, very briefly, go through or summarize the key changes that have come about. In the recent months, particularly the post-COVID changes in the labor laws. As was mentioned earlier, there is of course a great deal of continuity, and this attempt to change the labor regulation has been going on for last many years, particularly since the present regime came to power. Now, if you look at the 3 states, UP, Madhya Pradesh, and Gujarat, in the case of Uttar Pradesh, 35 out of 38 labor laws have been withdrawn, which includes the Factories Act, the Industrial Disputes Act, the Trade Union Act, the Minimum Wage Act, the Contract Labor Act, and so on and so forth. In Madhya Pradesh, the Industrial Relations Act is now not applicable to 11 major industries, except for a few sections. Factories which will start production in next 1,000 days actually need not come, are exempted from the Industrial Disputes Act. In UP and in Gujarat, maternity benefits and the Equal Remuneration Act both have been withdrawn. In Madhya Pradesh, the provision of creches, separate washrooms for men and women have been done away with. And in Gujarat, for the next 1 year, all labor laws except the Minimum Wages Act and the Employee Compensation Act and few acts related to the safety have been withdrawn. It needs to be also underlined that across all these states, the hire and fire the states have done away with the hire and fire restrictions imposed on them. Gujarat and UP have gone up to the extent of removing any option for any form of severance pay that could be given to the workers. UP and Gujarat have also done away with the Trade Union Act, while Madhya Pradesh had exempted major industries from the Industrial Relations Act. All the 3 states, in the name of fighting the ill effects of Corona, have expressed their intention to increase the length of the working day. And it has to be noted that these hours are increasing in a workplace that is no longer mandated to provide restrooms, washrooms, drinking water facilities for its workforce. With this ease of hire and fire and minimal union intervention that is possible as a result of these changes. It's very clear what we can see what the changes will mean for the workers. The key issue is that how does the state and how does the government get away with introducing these changes? What rationale, or how does it sort of build a consensus or attempts to build a consensus of these changes in the public discourse? No detailed rationale has been provided for changing these provisions, but some general arguments are being made and are floating around by those who support these legislative changes or these deregulation of the labor laws. One general argument that is being made, and that is being made across the board, not only for labor, for other things, is that these measures will help the country recover from the impact of the pandemic. This is like, we know the packaging of the old in a new bottle. This has been done in the case of how, there's changes that have been brought about in the defense sector recently, the disinvestment in the public sector, the changes and the liquidity that has been provided to the financial markets. But this time around, the government has also decided to use the same rationale and the same logic for bringing about changes in the labor laws. Specifically in relation to the argument of labor, one argument that is being made is that there is a great, the implementation of these rules and regulations increases the cost of hiring. And therefore, as a result of this higher cost provides disincentive for the investors. Employers either do not hire enough workers, or they hire workers in a framework which is not within the ambit of law. So we are being told that in a way, the laws that basically are meant to strengthen and support the workers work against the interest of the workers. And therefore, suspension of these regulatory frameworks perhaps might incentivize investment, and in the short to long run may have greater benefits for the workers in terms of improving their working conditions and average earnings. And we know that none of this is related to the facts on the ground. We know that very small percentage of workers work in the organized sector, and large number of workforce already are working beyond the ambit of labor laws. So one wonders how suspension of labor laws is going to incentivize new investments. If you look at the literature on investment between China and India, which is where the competitive framework is being applied, it's very clear that if you compare to China, the minimum wages in China are 3 times more than in India. There are other evidence to say that the underlying issue of competitiveness between India and other countries, China in particular, has nothing to do with really labor, but it's to do with other factors of production, particularly transport, power and other infrastructure costs, which is not the focus of the conversation. So that's one kind of rationale, which is factually, which has very poor roots in reality. The other argument being made for making these changes in the labor law is the compliance cost. And it's being said that there are high compliance costs to implement these legislations, and these compliance costs create counterproductive consequences. Put simply, essentially, it means that the existence of regulatory frameworks around labor leads to corruption, so-called Inspector Raj, and therefore, if we remove these, then this, the counterproductive consequences can be overcome if we remove these regulations. Once again, I mean, this is an argument that has been typically applied to labor. And one wonders there's a great deal of corruption in the law and order machinery, but we have never heard an argument to say that since there is so much corruption, let's try and get rid of the regulatory frameworks around law and order. If you look at in terms of the argument about Inspector Raj, there's enough evidence to say that the inspectorate staff is highly understaffed, and some averages suggest that for more than 1,000 plus factories, there was one inspector that was inspecting. So the argument about Inspector Raj is also not rooted in the last evidence in the last 15 to 20 years. Essentially, the labor laws or the implementation of the labor laws have been systematically diluted over the years without changing the laws. And the interesting question to ask today is that why are now they attempting to change these labor laws from the front door rather than letting them get diluted through the back door? Another argument that is being made is about the multiplicity of labor laws or privilege of multiplicity of laws. This again has nothing to do with either the changes that have been brought about or in terms of what was implemented, what existed even before. In fact, if you look at the specificities of the changes that have been implemented, this actually betrays the call for any simplicity that is being argued. Just to give a quick two instances, the Factories Act has been withdrawn, and it's the second section of the Factories Act which defines who is a worker. So having done away with the section which defines a worker, enforcement of certain privileges for workers under either the Minimum Wages Act or compensation to workers, etc., means very little. Similarly, when you talk about overtime and saying that they've retained the provisions of overtime, but they have redefined the working day. So having redefined the working day, what does it mean in terms of overtime? So there are numerous instances in the way the changes have been brought about that one would find no argument in support of suggesting that what we have is simplification of labor laws. In fact, the way the laws have been changed and certain sections have been retained, it will in fact complicate the interpretation and the implementation of whatever minimal labor regulatory framework that we have in our hands. Then when we talk about retaining the Act on compensation, we have talked about retaining the Act on compensation after withdrawing most provisions on safety. So the question, and the last question that I want to sort of, and it's a key question as far as all of us are concerned, is that how do we explain, and Professor Bhaduri touched on one or two aspects of this, of how do we explain why the government is doing it or how the state wants to initiate it now. Clearly, it is not something which is an oversight or an innocuous mistake or lack of information on the part of the state. It's a thought out strategy or thought out response, and to treat COVID as an opportunity for something that the state has been attempting to do for the last many years. So the COVID crisis is actually being treated as an opportunity to increase capital's control over labor, and in some ways it is different from the past. So the previous regimes have been also trying to continue to do the same, but now it is being done much more from the front door, or as Professor Bhaduri said, far more aggressively than what was done before. So what I'm suggesting is that the hostile attitude towards labor is a cold, calculated, intentional logic by the state, where the ruling class at the moment envisions a logic of accumulation in which it wants to relocate labor or recraft the role of labor such that it can increase the control of big capital in this country. So there is this reinventing or reimagining of the labor market that is being proposed, which has been attempted for many years, but which is being proposed now with the recent changes. That is exactly the reason why, in spite of such high levels of unemployment and such disastrous consequences on the income levels of workers, that the state has had the gumption, so to say, to implement these changes. And what is critical for us to sort of reflect upon is that how does the state build the consensus to go ahead and do this, which has, at a time when the labor, even in the front of the mainstream media, the precarity of labor has been most clearly presented. It's hit people on the face, yet the state is willing to sort of move forward and increase the precarity of labor. And I just want to say, last point, that the state has been doing, this particular government in particular, has been doing over the past some time, both in terms of the way the GST impacted the workers and the way the demonetization impacted the workers. But in the COVID crisis, the same phenomena or the same tendency is being further reinforced. And what I'm suggesting here is that the state has chosen, just last minute, that the state has chosen to promote a vision of development which does not have any space for labor-intensive growth, small business, self-employment, and decent conditions of work. What does it give for us? For me, it gives us an opportunity where we need not look as working class in terms of migrant labor, formal labor, informal labor. In fact, this is a moment for us, for the labor movement, to look at solidarities of labor across these categories. And in that sense, I think that as the state looks at this as an opportunity to implement its agenda and increase its control over labor, I think the present provocation provides us in the labor movement an opportunity to bring greater solidarities across labor, because the precarity, the conditions of precarity are now shared precarity across various categories of labor, so as to challenge the control of labor over capital. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sood, for giving that wonderful overview of the ongoing changes and posing it as part of a carefully orchestrated strategy going primarily against the interests of labor and calling attention to the need for consolidating, coming together to oppose it from all categories across the board amidst labor. Thank you very much. We will hear remarks very similar to yours in the subsequent presentations. Let me come back to Professor Ravi Srivastava, whose line was interrupted in the course of his presentation. Ravi, could you please go back to your presentation and complete it? We can't hear you. There is a problem. Hello, Ravi. You have to switch on or unmute. Hello, Ravi. Can you
hear me now?
Hello. Ravi.
You can hear me now? Hello?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can. Go ahead, please.
Dr. Joe, before I got interrupted by the disconnection, I was saying that the NCUS had proposed, basically, it understood Social Security as an inalienable human right. It proposed a universal frame for Social Security for all workers based on registration, portability, a legal entitlement to Social Security, and the institutional framework at the grassroots level of workers' facilitation centers. Now, since then, a lot of water has flown under the bridge. These recommendations were watered down. The legislation, which was, as you know, it went back to the cabinet thrice. The legislation which finally came into place, the Unorganized Workers Social Security Act, was a very diluted version, and it was a meaningless version. The new government has come up with the code on social security. First, Ramapriya here also were a part of a process with the central trade unions in developing a joint response and sending it both to the Ministry of Labor and then to the standing committee, the Parliamentary Standing Committee. And I want to point out to you that the code on social security, which is currently before Parliament, is actually a huge setback in the struggle for universal social security. And I'll put forward before you a few basic points. As I pointed out to you, most of these already are part of the joint position taken by the central trade unions to the Parliamentary Standing Committee. The first is, and I want to align with what the NCUS has said, the bill does not have any mandatory provisions for social security for the unorganized workers. There's nothing in it, not even registration is mandatory. There is nothing mandatory in the proposals that it makes for the unorganized workers at all. So it is not a step forward in the struggle for universal social security and even providing a legal framework for that social security in the country. Secondly, what it does is that it fragments the social security space between that for formal workers working in enterprises with 10 or more workers, the construction workers, and the remaining unorganized workers. Now, as far as the formal workers are concerned, those who work in enterprises, and I'm deliberately using the word formal workers, those who work in enterprises employing 10 or more workers, what this bill has done is that it has used a definition of employees. As you know, the definition of employees used in the ESIC Act and the EPF Act and so on is very broad. It's very liberal. It includes casual workers. It includes contract workers. So it includes unorganized workers in the formal sector. Now, what this bill has done, it has replaced it with a definition of employees which is very restrictive. Basically, it is restricted only to formal workers. Therefore, it is pushed out of its ranks, out of the ranks of formal social security. All unorganized workers have been pushed to the chapter 8 of the bill, which is for unorganized workers, where there is no mandatory social security provision at all. So it's a very retrograde bill in that sense. As far as construction workers are concerned, after a lot of struggle, though there is a chapter which has been retained for them, but this chapter is a shell of the proposals which had earlier been made. And if you look at the chapter, it incorporates almost nothing of the Supreme Court judgment in 2018. And I think the whole question of how does this Construction Workers Welfare Act or the provisions with respect to construction workers, how they can be implemented, again, this bill not only leaves it in a limbo, but takes a step backwards. The other thing is that if you remember, the Social Security Code in its initial versions covered 15 Social Security Acts. The final version of the code only encapsulates 7 acts. 8 acts have been left outside the purview of the Social Security Code under the general assumption that the cess collection mechanisms of these codes have been done away with. So the BD Workers Act, the Manganese Miner Workers Act, the Cine Workers Acts, and so on have been left out of the purview. So all these workers have again been pushed. All these workers were entitled to Social Security earlier. They have now been pushed into the ranks of the unorganized workers. And there is not even a footnote in the Act or anywhere else which tells us what has happened to the funds which had accrued to the Government of India under the various acts. So once again, it not only does not formalize workers, actually it informalizes workers. Those who were earlier entitled to Social Security have been pushed outside the ranks and put into the category of informal workers. So if then again, if you look at the way the Act has been set, as I said, in these 3 broad sections, the 5 chapters devoted to formal workers and the provisions which were earlier available to the organized sector, then the construction workers, and then the unorganized workers, there is no possibility of graduating. It actually almost disallows the possibility of unorganized workers graduating into the other sectors. It also, and this is very crucial when we look at the pandemic, that there has to be a specific provision. The trade unions have made this argument that when there are spells of unemployment, the Social Security provision should continue to govern workers. This provision, among many other provisions, is missing in the Act. So basically, yes, when you look at the progression even of this code till about 2017, the Government of India had aspired to create a framework for universal social security. The 2017 Act, on which there had been a lot of interaction between the ILO and the Government of India, gave us a much wider framework. However, in 2018, in the bill that was proposed, there was a complete regression, and this regression has resulted in a much narrower basis of the Act. And the final point I want to make is the whole question of delegated legislation. If you look at the 2 points I will make, one is if you look at all the labor codes, the scope of delegated legislation has been increased very significantly. Very critical provisions which were part of the EPF Act, which were part of the ESIC Act earlier, have now been taken out and put in the provisions of the delegated legislation. And finally, the whole question of definitions. I will not go into this in great detail. Critical definitions are missing. They have not been harmonized across the Act. In fact, all the codes are now creating a jumble of legislation, and basically they can only be, I have said this very often, but let me repeat it, that these codes could only have been created by a government which believes that the courts will act according to its own bidding. In other words, it behaves as though the courts do not exist. So I think the labor code is a great step backward. And if you then look at the labor laws, which have, the amendments in the labor laws which have taken place in the last 4 weeks, and Atul has already made a reference to them, you see that in many cases, in many states, even the basic social security laws have been abrogated. For example, in UP, all the laws relating to social security have been abrogated. This will also be the case in Gujarat. Even the Maternity Benefit Act, which this government itself, the provisions of which it brought, have been abrogated. So I think this is where we stand as far as the social security framework is concerned. I just want to make a last point, and this is with respect to Jerry's lecture at the very beginning and he covered this whole terrain of universal basic income. I will, in a nutshell, want to say that the concept of the social security floor, social protection floor, which was put forward in the crisis after 2008 and 9 as a fairly developed concept. And I have written about it extensively, including its financial requirements in an ILO report in 2013. Actually, this is a much broader concept, because not only does it include income protection through the life cycle of the worker and her family, but it also includes the concept of essential services being provided to the worker. And any concept of social protection or social security, which actually delinks the two and only talks of income in some nominal fashion, apart from all the other things which Jerry mentions, I feel should be discussed and debated, even though the simplicity of the universal concept of universal basic income is somehow making it very attractive. And however, in the present juncture, of course, many of us, including those of us in the Indian Society of Labor Economics, did propose an emergency transfer of income for 3 months and 6 months based on current levels of minimum wage in order to alleviate the suffering of the worker, the informal workers, and also to create and infuse demand in the economy. That is another issue. In the long issue, I think the concept of social protection floor, which is a broader concept, is something which I would still think is something which needs to be discussed and debated, and if possible, it is within the feasible zone of implementation in the country like India. So this is something we should perhaps argue for. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Srivastava. It was really rewarding to listen to you taking such a strong position against the kind of proposed changes in the labor regulations. But then talking about your favorite subject, the social security provisions, let me say, here sitting with us is the finance minister of the state, Dr. Thomas Isaac, who is very keen on establishing a practical approach towards providing social security to all those people in the construction sector. And suppose we raise this question with you, can we ever take care of the interests of the casual laborers in the construction sector with social security provisions? To me, it is a long shot. The immediate priority is to take care of the regular workers in the informal sector. The formal sector, as we all know, is very well taken care of. It's the regular workers in the informal sector, people paid on a weekly or a monthly basis, nonetheless have a secure job, sort of. Can we bring them under the purview of social security regulations? If we are able to tackle that to begin with, then going further to take care of the construction workers or the casual workers spread all over the state in a multiplicity of industries, sectors, occupations becomes easier. If you are there, you can come back to us answering this question, because the government of Kerala and the chairman of the board of the Gulati Institute, Dr. Isaac, was today in front of the labor minister asking the same question: can we take care of them? All these construction workers coming into the state and now going back, is there a way of taking care of them under the ambit of the social security provisions? It's a question we're raising before you. Hopefully, you can come back to us with answers. Now, let me come to the next speaker, Professor Prabhu Mahapatra. I'm sorry, you will be speaking about the evolution of labor laws in the country. I'm afraid the sequence of presentations is slightly misleading, but then we had to accommodate different priorities. Professor Mahapatra, please go ahead.
Can you hear me? I unfortunately can't seem to unmute myself.
We can hear you. Please go ahead.
Okay, but can you see me? I can't. I can see some of you, but I can't see. So thank you very much for Dr. Jose for inviting me to be part of this wonderful webinar. And I wanted to just point out what would be a contribution of an historian to the questions which are being raised here. Do we really have? We barely see ourselves ever as having any influence on any policy, whether for the government, definitely, but also for major social actors. A way in which we keep on forgetting and forgetting lessons from history in some sense. So it may be just to remind ourselves of, to look at this current changes in particular long-term perspective. That's my aim, just to not to find solutions or even to suggest some, but to place it in a historical context so that we can see the logic and the limits of that logic also simultaneously. And now the term which I kept hearing in the first set of presentations in the earlier morning was, from some of them, was about this archaic labor laws. This is somehow very strange. The word archaic, by already suffixing labor laws with archaism, you already have condemned it in some sense. Condemned it to obsolescence, its irrelevance, and so on and so forth. But what would have been interesting to look at this question would have been to find out how come this labor laws at all came about, and why did they come about at all in the first place? If they were so irrelevant now, or were there point of time, and what was the nature of that relevance? Why was it at all? Why did it force? So if you don't answer that question, the irrelevance question of the present is purely what is called purely in a very short term and a framework of short term and short term explanation. So in order to understand so my question is not that why there is such a huge expansion of informal sector, or what is happening in the present context, which is leading to further informalization, which everyone agrees, which will be the result of these changes, proposed changes of labor law, even though they are called temporary. I want to first point out that in a way, the proposed changes are in themselves truly archaic. That means if you want to place a particular time frame in which such thinking was actually prevalent, it was the 19th century. It was the 19th century in which the kind of law proposals that we are seeing were very much prevalent and very much part of the public discourse and sensibility of. So in a sense, we are not removing archaic labor laws, we are in fact going back to an archaic labor law regime, which is supposed to be placed in this sense. So the new regime, proposed regime, is, in my view, the first point I would like to say, and I'll show it quite quickly, is in some sense archaic. So in order to also, the second point I would make is that if you also want to understand the significance of the change, is it part of a well thought out agenda, or is it a default position taken by groups of a certain, by the policymakers? I would say that we need to understand what is happening today. That is, how do you place the current crisis? Where do you see it? Do you see it only as an extension of the last 30 or 40 years? That means, is it only a continuation of neoliberal regime, or is it a result of a crisis of the neoliberal regime? Are we going to take into account that this crisis, which is happening, which is accentuated by the COVID, is actually a result, is actually perhaps lead to a major change, a major transformation? It cannot be, or depends on how you view it, it cannot be merely the extension of the earlier regime. So if, in order to even fight properly, we need to place ourselves. Is it a result? Is it a point at which the crisis is becoming, what I say, crisis is really is a transformative crisis? Will it transform into something very bad or something worse than ever before? Or is there some possibility of something new emerging? And that's why I think it's some time should be given to understand what is the present nature of this crisis. How long will neoliberalism go on? Are we going to put our oppositional energy to a dying force? Is it a dying system? Is it something which is in a way being transformed? I think there are a lot of views about it, but I would put myself in the second position that we should take that much more seriously. That it is a crisis of the neoliberal thinking. So if we had to place the current changes in labor laws, we need to place it in relation to so what I would call at least three big chunks of time. We would think of first the chunk nearest to us. How did this so-called archaic labor system, a labor regime based on protective labor laws, how did they come about? So because there was something before labor law existed. That means this set of labor laws which are there had a prehistory to it, had a history to it, had something preceding it. And what was the nature of that which allowed or which forced the change or towards what we today call the labor regime of the so-called old labor regime, protective. So let's call it protective labor protective law regime. How did that come about? Till the 19th century, most of the advanced capitalist countries in India, the basis of the basis of legal control of labor was based on what we would call a penal contract regime. That means workers were criminalized. That means workers, if they fought for rights or asked for wage increase or they stopped working if the conditions are bad, were criminalized. And that's a very significant and very widespread system of legal regime which existed, which were there in plantations, which emerged in the 19th century following the slave plantations, or they were in many parts of the world in different situations. In England, when Karl Marx was writing about free labor, every year 10,000 workers were put into jail for breach of contract. This is for years together. Thousands of workers were criminally prosecuted for breach of contract. And this was common in the wide range, including in France, Germany, and in the United States, in large amount, what we would know as unfree remained a major system of labor. And this is changed in the 19th century, late 19th century. What are the three main drivers for this change? Why did we have a system like what we call shorter hours of work, safety, worker safety? What did it come about? The first and the major driver for that, apart from the labor movement, which is, I would say, was a very important driver, the labor movement of the 19th century. But what changed or what drove it was also changes in the structure of the corporate structure. The emergence of what we know as large corporates is from this time. And they required a different type of contract system, which could not have been provided by hire and fire and a completely so-called unregulated free market system which existed there. Now that was the second big driver of that. So the labor movement, the changes in the corporate structure which was there, and third, of course, was the way in which the political economy was itself changing. That means not just what was immediately happening at the workplace, but in the way in which the social processes were the demand that the disruption caused by unregulated labor market was now being asked to be tamed. Now, all these, of course, after the First World War, setting up the ILO, created the condition for the first time of creating what we know as a system of labor regime, what we call the formal labor contract system. Now, those formal labor contract system in the West and in India, as it happened under colonial labor regime, where most of our labor laws actually were enacted by the British during the British period, including the ID Act or before that. Now, we have for a long period of time, from the 1920s roughly till the first to the independence, the evolution or development of these systems. Now, what is the key system which is being developed here was the key change was a shift from purely looking at production to what was known as a greater concern with social reproduction. The greater concern with social reproduction, that means how, so that's where we have first time a weaving in of what we call regulatory regimes with welfare regimes, control regimes with welfare regimes. And this created first the triangulation of forces, the state, capital, and labor. And this triangulation state undergirding the creation of a new social contract or new form of contract, which is called the employment contract, which was an unusual contract which did not exist before. In contract theory itself, it didn't exist. It was a new type of contract.
Bapu, can we request you to conclude it in a minute?
Yeah, okay. So what I'm saying is this changed. This was there, of course, this system remained in place till the 1970s, and then the deregulatory regimes again kicked in. And now we are at the end of a great wave of deregulation. What I am suggesting that what we should see is that these changes which are there are in some senses are default positions taken by the policymakers. They are not really thinking about what real changes are taking place in the world of work, and how to design a labor regime which would be actually appropriate for both generating employment and quality employment, and also placing it. So if I just want to finish it with, I would say that the point made earlier by many of our speakers, but that the necessity now is to knowing very well the connection between informal workers and formal workers. The main position is not only to defend the rights of the labor law, but also to extend these rights. So demand should be of an offensive nature, to say that we need to have greater rights for informal workers. And instead of just merely saying we must protect labor law alone. In fact, this provides us a real opportunity for combined, and it's already been happening in several ways. And I think this is where I would like to end and say that this is what I hope, that this will change the balance of forces between capital and labor and the state. So difficult, but this is a great opportunity to transform it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Prabhu Mahapatra. It's great to have a historian coming into this discussion. But then, since we are running short of time, let me not take more on your presentation. I know Shyamsundar and Dr. Radhika Kapoor, you are keen on concluding your presentation by 3 o'clock. Shall I still go ahead 4 o'clock? Shall I still go by the order and call you a little, I mean, as in the order given, Shyamsundar, or would you like?
We would like to come in. We would like to come in. Rama, Radhika, and I.
All right. Now, okay. Then, which means Ramapriya, Gopalakrishnan, she comes next.
Yeah, sure.
So, yeah. Afterwards, I'm going to request Insaf Nizam to come a little later. You will come after Ramapriya Gopalakrishnan, and then Shyamsundar, and then after Radhika Kapoor.
Yeah, right. Thanks. Yeah, that's great.
The floor is open to Dr. Ramapriya Gopalakrishnan. Okay. Dr. Ramapriya.
Able to hear me now?
Okay. Okay. Yes, we can hear you. Please.
I'll be speaking about the legality of the recent changes to the labor laws made by various state governments in the wake of the COVID-19 crisis. I would like to first say that none of the changes made by the various state governments would stand the scrutiny of law. And this is for 3 reasons. The changes made are in violation of the fundamental rights protected under the Constitution of India. The changes made are in violation of the various international labor standards ratified by India. And thirdly, the changes have not been preceded by effective consultations with workers' organizations as mandated under Recommendation 152, which is the tripartite consultation recommendation, which accompanies the Tripartite Consultation Convention, Convention 144, that has been ratified by India. Now, the changes made by the state governments can be broadly classified into 4 categories. 1 is the extension of the daily and weekly hours of work. 2 is exemption from various labor laws. 3 is increase in the threshold for the application of various laws. And 4 is the exemption from labor inspection. Now, coming to the first kind of change, as you're all aware, 11 states have increased the daily and weekly hours of work they've increased the daily limit of work up to 12 hours a day and the weekly limit up to 72 hours a day. This is in violation of Convention number 1, the very first convention of the ILO, the Hours of Work Industry Convention of 1919, which has been ratified by India. This convention stipulates a maximum of 8 hours of work a day and 48 hours of work a week. In exceptional circumstances, it allows for a temporary exemption to be made in cases of force majeure by allowing an additional hour of work. But it allows for just 1 additional hour of work in the case of a force majeure situation, which means the hours of work can be increased from 8 to 9 hours a day. But the increase by 4 additional hours of work to 12 hours a day and 72 hours a week is not in conformity with Convention number 1. Secondly, increasing the daily and weekly hours of work to 12 and 72 respectively. Obviously, it would be in violation of the right of workers to just and human conditions of work, which is protected under Article 21 of the Constitution of India, because the right to life has been held by the Supreme Court to encompass the right to health and the right to just and human conditions of work. So this also violates Article 21 of the Constitution of India and is therefore not sustainable. Now coming to the second type of change, exemption from various labor laws. The government of Uttar Pradesh has passed an ordinance exempting all factories and manufacturing establishments in the states for a period of 3 years from the application of various labor laws. First of all, this amounts to an abuse of the concurrent power of the state. States have concurrent powers to frame laws. They have the concurrent powers to even amend central labor laws, but the concurrent power cannot be used to altogether dispense with the application of central labor laws and create a vacuum. So when state governments exercise this power to completely do away with central labor laws and create a vacuum, it amounts to abuse of concurrent power. The concurrent power can't be used in this manner. And just like states cannot use their legislative power in this manner, it also follows that the ordinance making power under Article 213 of the Constitution, the ordinance making power by the governor cannot be used in this manner to create a vacuum in the area of, to do away with central labor legislation and create a vacuum. It cannot be used in this manner. Now, the exemption from various labor laws ordinance of Uttar Pradesh, as speakers before me had pointed out, one of the implications of this ordinance is none of the 3 laws relating to industrial relations, the Trade Unions Act, the Industrial Disputes Act, and the Industrial Employment Standing Orders Act. None of these 3 laws will apply in the state of Uttar Pradesh for a period of 3 years. This means that workers in the state cannot register trade unions. They will have no avenue of grievance redressal. They cannot go on strike. They cannot enter into collective bargaining. So this virtually renders the right to freedom of association under Article 19(1)(c) of the Constitution nugatory. Then it also amounts to violation of the right to demonstration, which is protected under Article 19(1)(a), read with Article 19(1)(b) of the Constitution. Then in terms of international labor standards, it is very clearly in violation of the rights which are protected under Conventions 87 and 98. Now, India has not ratified these 2 conventions, but regardless of its non-ratification, it is expected to respect, promote, and realize the rights contained in these conventions by virtue of being a member of the ILO and being bound by the Constitution of the ILO. And this principle has also been reiterated in the 1998 Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work. So this move to exempt labor laws from the application of, exempt factories from the application of labor laws relating to industrial relations goes against the Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work and Articles 19(1)(b) and (c) of the Constitution. Then it also follows that as a result of the ordinance, various social security laws will not apply. This again is in violation of Article 21 of the Constitution of India. Then the laws relating to working conditions will not apply. The laws relating to occupational safety and health will not apply. Then factories need not even provide basic amenities like toilets, drinking water, and canteen facilities. So all these are in violation of the right to health of workers and the right to just and human conditions of work, which, as I said earlier, are encompassed in the right to life protected under Article 21 of the Constitution of India. So the changes made by the governments of Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, and Gujarat, exempting factories from the application of various labor laws, will also not stand the scrutiny of law. And similarly, now in the state of Madhya Pradesh, third-party certification is permitted in place of labor inspection in the case of factories employing less than 50 workers and having non-hazardous processes. Now, Goa has also proposed to have a system of self-certification in the place of labor inspection. Now, these kinds of changes, they will violate the Labor Inspection Convention, Convention number 81, which has been ratified by India. So these again will not stand the scrutiny of law. And the fourth kind of change is increase in the threshold numbers. For example, Tripura, it has increased the numbers in the Factories Act from 10 to 20 and 20 to 40 for the application of the Factories Act. It has also increased the numbers for the application of the Contract Labor Act from 20 to 50. Now, other states have also done this before. Before the COVID-19 crisis, several states have amended the Factories Act and the Contract Labor Act, increasing the numbers. But then the effect of this again is that it leaves a large number of factories unregulated altogether. And workers in these factories and contract labor in these factories will be outside the purview of protective labor laws. And this again is in violation of the right to equality. It is in violation of the right to life protected by Article 21. So I would again like to summarize by saying that none of these changes will stand the scrutiny of law because they violate fundamental rights, they violate international labor standards, particularly the standards which have been ratified by India, and they are also will not stand the scrutiny of law for the reason that they have been framed or enacted without consultation with representative workers' organizations. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ramapriya Gopalakrishnan, for making those wonderful points about the illegality of the laws, the change in laws now being contemplated. You touched on several emotive issues, the earliest conventions of the ILO. The first one on hours of work is actually the first clause of the Paris Peace Agreement after the war. It's an inheritance of humanity. Let's not go into the details. What we are doing is a systematic undoing of all those precious inheritances which the working class all over the world obtained. We just try to undermine them one by one. And the illegality of those ventures, you highlighted them. Thank you for bringing in that wonderful intervention. On the question of threshold, we'll have an opportunity to revisit the ground. Let me therefore request permission from Mr. Insaf Nizam and give priority to Shyam Sundar and Radhika Kapoor ahead of him so that they can go for another meeting. My apologies to Insaf Nazim of the ILO, therefore Shyam Sundar.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks, Jose, and thanks to the other panelists who have graciously given us room. The topic I've been given is tripartism and labor regulation. And the best way to start is to mention the Social Dialogue International Labor Standards Framework. The ILO defines social dialogue as all types of negotiations, consultations, or even simple exchanges of information, formal or informal, between or among representatives of governments, employers, and workers at several levels, namely national, regional, industry, and firm, on issues of common interest relating to economic and social policy. This is the most comprehensive definition or description of social dialogue given by the ILO. And social dialogue typically is backed by the other complementary rights such as freedom of association, right to collective bargaining, the Tripartite Consultation Convention 1976, and various other recommendations. I found out this very important recommendation which is not very much mentioned in the public policy debate, namely the Consultation Industrial and National Levels Recommendation 1960, recommendation 113. I found it to be very useful. All of them talk about freedom of association and collective bargaining, and of course the duty of the ratifying government to establish measures to promote effective consultation. The operative word here is effective at the national level and various other levels between the three parties. Now, India, even before independence, had established social dialogue and even other forms of dialogue. I may briefly mention them to set the context. Owing to the exigencies of Second World War, the British colonial government thought it fit to have certain non-statutory consultations. Primarily, two of them merit attention. One is the Indian Labour Conference and its administrative committee called Standing Labour Committee, which is tripartite in nature, and the Labour Ministers Conference, which is, and both these institutions, consultative institutions, are continuing even till date. So we have a long history of tripartism and consultation in India. So I may quickly come to an historical classification of tripartism in India. I classified them into four temporal categories. 1940 to 1965 or 69 is a golden period of tripartism, during which the social dialogue, that is tripartite consultations, played an extremely important role, as was attested by the first National Commission on Labour and later other committees, in laying down the legislative and economic policy framework during the command economy. Between 1940 and 1969, India witnessed as many as 26 Indian Labour Conferences, almost uninterrupted. Then from 1972 to 1990, there was a lull, save for a couple of Indian Labour Conferences during the 80s. And then 1990 onwards, and when 1991, when the economic reforms took place, then the Indian Labour Conference was activated primarily to discuss the fallouts of the economic reform policy measures. And I would now, and then we have this is 1992 to 2014, and then 2015 onwards. Now, if I have to look at the characteristic of the stage, following Professor Amit Baudry and Atul Sood, 1940 to 1969, and we had the welfare stage, and then 1970s, the authoritarian state. Even the Janata Party, I would call it a mild authoritarian stage. And 1980s, the missing stage. 1992 onwards, the neoliberal stage, but 1992 to 1999, soft neoliberal stage. And 1999 to 2004, aggressive neoliberal state, that was the NDA 1. And 2004 to 2014, confused stage because of the UPA coalition. And 2015 onwards, aggressive and impatient stage. So this is a kind of a characterization I would go for. And we all know that social dialogue or tripartism is an important mechanism for the government, not only to convey its policy intentions, but also secure the views and perspectives of the stakeholders, primarily the trade unions and employers organizations. And 1992 to 2014, we had 16 Indian Labour Conferences, and the concomitant policy output was there were several policy measures taken to protect the interests of labour, but no labour flexibility reforms could take place. And then the NDA 1 came into power in 2014, and 2015 was the most recent, the last India Labour Conference that was done. In 2018, India government tried to do one, but it was it could not carry on because of the threat of boycott by central trade unions, including its own BMS. Now, I ask a question. We all know that I'm not going to repeat in so many words that the government, the central government, has not consulted effectively, meaningfully the trade unions, but now the tripartism has degenerated into a kind of a partial bipartism. That is, in the golden years, we had the tripartism, that is parity between labor, capital, and government. In the neoliberal situation, it is G to B, that is government to business, strengthened, whereas G to L, that is the government and trade unions, weakened. Why is it so? To me, it's a neoliberal logic. There are two propositions that I put forward. In a globalized economy, the state feels that there is a need for quick labor reforms in order to strengthen ease of doing business, which would have certain adverse implications for labor rights. And the need of the hour, according to this school, flexibility school and the neoliberal logic, is to extend flexible labor laws. And we are witnessing the same which have been detailed by Atul Sood and Ramapriya Gopalakrishnan. But they feel, the state feels, the neoliberal logic feels that there is a structural rigidity inherent in social dialogue. Now, the argument that in the 1940 to 69, the social dialogue for tripartism worked well, yes, the argument is that it is easy to make laws because there were guideposts like the ILO and the Constitution. But it is difficult to amend laws because people have ideological fixations. It is painstaking and time-consuming, and it is even frustrating. In fact, there are people who said that if tripartism doesn't work, the state can go ahead and do unilateral lawmaking, which the NDA government has resorted to. There are two scenarios then for social dialogue, analytically. Where trade unions are strong, which is at the national level, keep social dialogue alive, even symbolic. V.S. Naipaul says that India is a country of symbolism. It appears so now. So at the national level, we have symbolic social dialogue. And where trade unions are fragmented and political opposition is weak, avoid or ignore social dialogue, which is at the regional level. I may add here, we have the State Labour Advisory Board. I do not know in the context of Kerala. Jose, you must ask the Finance Minister whether the State Labour Advisory Board in Kerala is active. Then what are the hazards of unilateralism? Now, when social dialogue is considered to be inefficient, though not justifiably so, then there are two things that happen. Lawmaking takes a second place, and the state uses ordinances and government orders in order to introduce labor law reform. So two kinds of consequences take place. Number one, legislative failure, and number two, lawmaking through executive orders. And this leads to mediocre outcomes. This is my core argument. Unilateralism inevitably leads to mediocre outcomes because of two reasons. Number one, the state listens to one side, here the capital, as Professor Amit Chaudhary has said, and there is a weakening of labor institutions. On the other hand, there is also a weakening of legislative institutions because executive orders replace the legislative mechanism, and as a result, the lawmaking is very poor. The UP ordinance, if anybody has seen, it's a stupid piece of lawmaking. Now, the alternative for the government is to consult experts, and there is an inherent hazard in consulting experts because the experts will say something which is not acceptable to the government. So there are voice deficits. I have 1 minute, Jose. 1.5 minutes.
Shyam Sundar.
One more minute. There are voice deficits, and we get unsound industrial relations, industrial violence, etc. So the neglect of tripartism leads to unilateralism, which leads to suboptimal outcomes in the industrial relations system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Shyam Sundar. Let me next invite Radhika Kapoor, with apologies to all those people sequentially listed. And Dr. Radhika Kapoor, please take the floor.
Thank you, Dr. Jose, for the invitation to be a part of this panel. It's a privilege indeed. I've been asked to speak on employment trends in the unorganized sector. So before getting into the trends, just a quick recap of what the definition of the unorganized sector is. So the NCUS defined the unorganized sector as consisting of all unincorporated private enterprises owned by individuals or households, which were operated on a proprietary or partnership basis and with less than 10 workers. Now, this was the enterprise-based definition of the unorganized sector, but this has also then been expanded into a definition based on work relationships. And unorganized workers were defined as those who not only worked in unorganized enterprises, but also those who worked in organized enterprises, but without any provisions for social security benefits. Okay, we can go to the next slide, and I can just talk through the data there. So to understand what the trends in employment have been over time in India, this is data from household surveys from 2004-05 and from the periodic labor force survey of 2017-18. which basically breaks down the employment structure into the organized and the unorganized sector, and it further disaggregates employment by the type of employment status. So whether, a person is in a regular wage salary job or self-employed or casual. And what we find here, if you look at the second column, which has data on the unorganized sector, we find that the share of the unorganized sector in total employment has declined over time. From 2004-05, when it was about 89%, it has gone down to about 82% in 2017-18. But what has concomitantly happened is that you have seen increasing informalization happen in the organized sector. So the share of informal workers in the organized sector has increased. And as a consequence of these two forces, the overall share of unorganized workers or informal workers in total employment in India has remained pretty much stagnant. It was about 93% in 2004-05, and it barely moved down to about 91% in 2017-18, despite the fact that the share of the unorganized sector in total employment increased, because the number of informal workers in the organized sector increased. The reason I'm flagging this is because so much of the conversation we have about labor regulations, especially the changes that have happened recently, pertain to the organized sector. But a large proportion of the workforce really remains outside of the organized sector. In fact, even several workers in the organized sector remain out of the purview of several of these regulations. And so a very large portion, an overwhelming large proportion, in fact, is left completely unprotected against arbitrary action of employers and have no social security. And therefore, the conversation around labor regulations, as many of the speakers before me have said, needs to focus more on the unorganized sector. Now, of course, there are several regulations which cover the unorganized sector as well. This is either in part or in a few cases in totality. And I'm going to pick up just two of these here to highlight a few points about the weak implementation of these regulations in the unorganized sector. So if, for example, if we look at the Building and Construction Workers Act, which again several speakers have highlighted since the morning. So the Building and Construction Workers Act was essentially regulates the employment and conditions of service for building and construction workers. And then there's also the BOCW CESS Act, which provides for levy and collection of cess on the cost of construction incurred by employers, with the idea of augmenting resources for these workers. Now, when the pandemic and the lockdown was announced, state governments were advised by the Ministry of Labour to transfer funds in the account of construction workers through direct benefit transfers from the cess, which was consolidated by the construction welfare boards. But what ended up happening, despite the fact that this initiative was announced, given the nature of the construction labor market, the fact that about over 80% of the workforce is casual in nature, and the functioning of the construction welfare boards, the effective implementation of these measures has actually posed a big challenge. Now, there are several challenges in the collection of the cess, the distribution of the cess among workers. For instance, the low utilization ratios that are there. There's a share of the cess which is spent to the share that is actually collected is very low. And for India as a whole, the share of construction workers cess spent to what was actually collected in 2019 was a mere 39%. Now, of course, there was considerable amount of regional disparity here as well. For instance, in Maharashtra, the share was as low as 5.4%, but in Kerala, it was 120%. Also, there is also been lack of uniformity in the implementation of welfare schemes by these construction welfare boards. It is clearly stated in the BOCW Act that under the social welfare schemes, there are certain areas like health, education, housing, as well as skill development would be given priority. But in fact, many of these schemes are unrelated to priority welfare schemes. The other key lacuna that came out of this act, which again, Professor Ravi Srivastava also talked about the problem of registration of these unorganized workers. What was found is that the number of workers who were registered with the construction welfare boards was actually a fairly low amount compared to the number of construction workers that are actually there. There were about 35 million construction workers which were registered with the construction welfare boards, when we know from data from the Periodic Labour Force Survey that there are about 54 million construction workers in India. And this points to the difficulties in registration. We know from various surveys that have been conducted over the years prior to the pandemic as well, that there have been instances of selective registration, renewal of registration is difficult. There is also enrollment of non-construction workers as beneficiaries. So there's considerable amount of corruption there as well. And again, for India as a whole, while just about 52% of all construction workers were registered with the construction welfare boards, there was considerable disparity, regional disparity across states. There were some states like Maharashtra again, where there were just 0.66 million people, million construction workers who were registered with the board as of 2018-19. And so that was just 23% of all the construction workers in the state. But on the other hand, there were other states where, like Delhi, the ratio was very high. But the problem also is that given that a lot of the workers are migrant workers, particularly in the construction sector, if the fund is collected in one state, but the worker who is often attached to a contractor migrates to another state, then where is he going to be a beneficiary? Is it going to be in the first state or the second state or both? And this issue of portability is one that has come up again and again, ever since the breakdown of the onset of the pandemic and the exodus of migrant labor. And here, it's not enough to say that the issue of portability of benefits will be resolved later through rules which are formulated by central and state governments. This portability issue needs to be tackled by the Code on Social Security. And we know that there are several gaps in that, as Professor Ravi Srivastava explained. So essentially, the effective implementation of a relief package, which was in fact announced by the state, has not happened simply because of the half-hearted functioning of these construction welfare boards. And now let me move to one more act, which I think is very pertinent to the unorganized sector. It's perhaps more pertinent to the unorganized sector than it is to the organized sector. And this is the Minimum Wage Act, which has now been subsumed under the Code on Wages. Now, the Minimum Wage Act of 1948 was applicable basically to all workers engaged in scheduled employments and provided for fixing a minimum wage rate for various kinds of employments. So what ended up happening, or what still happening in fact, is that we have an entire minimum wage structure. Some estimates suggest that about over 400 scheduled employments and over 1,900 scheduled job categories for unskilled workers. So the implementation of the Minimum Wage Act is, of course, extremely difficult, given that you have this mammoth minimum wage structure. And of course, the coverage was not universal because there were unorganized workers who were covered only under the scheduled employment who got covered by this act. So the Code on Wages, under which the Minimum Wage Act is subsumed, it actually allows for universalization of minimum wages, which is a positive development indeed. But its implementation is going to be a particularly daunting task. Now, this code, the reason why it's so important is, particularly for the unorganized workers, is because they have little or no bargaining power. And as Professor Bhadari explained in his introductory remarks, that there is an interrelationship between the organized and the unorganized sector, in particular in the context of wage setting. Now, we know, again, there are several studies which have documented this, that there are weaknesses in implementing minimum wages, particularly in the unorganized sector. And there are several surveys which have shown the share of workers which are earning less than their legal minimum wage is in fact quite high. So the implementation of these wages poses a challenge in the unorganized sector. And this is something which we need to, which needs to be thought through in terms of how this can be strengthened, because that will then set a wage floor in the unorganized sector and provide a rallying point for workers in the unorganized sector to organize. So in this context, one of the things is that what this code does is it once again creates a fairly complex minimum wage structure. It talks about multiplicity of minimum wage wages, which are going to be fixed not just across geographical regions, which makes sense, but also on the basis of skill, arduousness, and hazardness of work. So it's in fact extremely complicated. Now, here it's worth thinking about how we can create a minimum wage framework which is in fact easier to implement. Now, the idea of a minimum wage really is to ensure that the wage is set at a level where the worker is able to meet at least his essential needs. And the workers who are really at the bottom of the pyramid are casual laborers in agriculture or in unorganized industry and services. So the simplest form of intervention would be to target these kind of workers. So if there was a minimum wage which was set for the casual, unskilled workers, then that would serve as an effective floor and could also be easier to implement. Of course, it is also the case that workers in the unorganized sector are often not even aware of what minimum wage is, and therefore you need to build up. There needs to be greater administrative efforts to do widespread dissemination of that wage. But to actually make the minimum wage effective, it is also important that the officially announced minimum wage is paid in all public work programs, in particular programs like NREGA, which involve casual, unskilled labor. And what we have seen in the past is that the wages which are paid in NREGA are on average 40 to 50% lower than prevailing minimum wages for unskilled agricultural workers, depending on the region of employment. So unless we actually set the NREGA wages in line with the minimum wages, in particular of the unskilled casual worker, it will be very challenging to in fact implement this going forward. And finally, for the minimum wage to be meaningful, to actually address the purpose for which it was set up, which is to meet the needs of those, the most essential needs of those in the unorganized workers, it actually has to be set out using a need-based criteria that was laid out by the International Labour Conference in 1957. And recently there was an expert committee which was set up by the government to propose a minimum wage fixation methodology, and it arrived at this figure of 375 rupees per day. But soon after it was put out in the public domain, the government in fact didn't accept that minimum wage and instead went ahead and announced a national minimum wage of 178 rupees a day. So this wage, unless there is effective implementation of this wage, in particular in the unorganized sector, very little can actually happen in terms of enhancing the bargaining power of workers here. So I just wanted to pick out on these two laws which are applicable to the unorganized sector to highlight effective implementation of these can help in improving the conditions of work in the unorganized sector and therefore also in the organized sector. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Radhika Kapoor. And let me now, I'm sorry for breaking the sequence of presentations, but then we come back to the fundamental principles and rights at work. I request Insaf Nizam of the ILO to speak on principles and rights at work in times of crisis. Thank you. Are you there? Hello, Insaf?
Yes, thank you, Dr.
Yes.
Jose. Yeah, let me take the floor. Okay. So thank you very much for giving this opportunity, and I'm humbled to be in the presence of some very eminent speakers. My approach to the subject would be a little bit different. I'm coming from a crisis perspective and looking at fundamental principles and rights at work in a crisis context. As you all know, ILO was born in the aftermath of a crisis and married to the UN in the aftermath of another crisis, global crisis, and it has over the 100 years accumulated a vast amount of experience in supporting member states in handling crisis situations prudently, crisis and fragile situations. Times of crisis are extraordinary times and require extraordinary efforts, as well as unconventional approaches. It is understandable that in facing an unprecedented crisis like this, as we are seeing today, leaders and decision makers of all walks, I'm not pointing the finger to any particularly leadership as political or business, it's all leaders, they may not have all the answers and perfect solutions to all the issues. However, there is sufficient past experience to learn from and to avoid mistakes that have been made by countries, member states in previous situations of crisis. So in this regard, there are a few key risks that I would like to highlight in responding to crisis situations, which, if not taken care of, can affect the fundamental principles and rights at work that India has committed to to, as other panelists pointed out, through the Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work Declaration of 1998, as well as 6 out of the 8 core conventions on child labor, forced labor, freedom of association and collective bargaining, and discrimination at work. So one risk is failing to realize the underlying causes of the crisis. I mean, most of the challenges and issues faced during crisis situations are deep-rooted and underlying issues that are exacerbated during the crisis or exposed as a result of the crisis and not necessarily created by the crisis. So one should not treat such issues as just started after the crisis. Unless the root causes are identified and addressed properly, we will not find a proper solution to the issues that we are facing. So issues like huge informality, the contractual precarity of contracts, weakness or absence of social security systems or social outreach of social security benefits, lack of access to basic services, and structural and ingrained discrimination and structural vulnerabilities, right, are the root causes of crisis, of which we need to address if we are to address or remedy the crisis correctly. So in this regard, another risk that member states might face is the mixing between responses or failing to have a right balance between different dimensions of the response. Now, in a crisis like this, you might have the health dimension, the humanitarian dimension, the administrative and law enforcement dimension, the economic dimension, the legal and policy dimension, and other dimensions as well. I just mentioned a few. Leaders and decision makers should be careful not to provide a humanitarian dimension, for instance, where there is a need for a social security response, right? It's not about distributing water bottles where a real social security response is needed to reduce the vulnerabilities, or to provide a law enforcement response where an economic response is needed, right? So to identify not only the right response, but also to identify the right balance between different responses or the combination of dimensions between responses where there is a need for a multidimensional response. So it's not just a one track or response just addressing the most dominant or the most apparent dimension, but to understand the issue better. And in this case, the third risk that countries or member states or leaders of all walks can fall into is to rush into legislation or to provide an overly legalistic response to the crisis, right? So this has two aspects of risks. One is the risk of content legislative measures without proper data or analysis and consultation of the stakeholders, right? Here, particularly, we are talking about the constituents, the social partners. So responses without that level of consultation can often defeat the very purpose of those measures, the legal measures that they are that have been taken. So also, in an unprecedented crisis like this, even if there is a need for legal reform, it's only prudent to try and take the time and effort to understand the multiple dimensions of the crisis and analyze them before rushing into either creating, amending, or even suspending laws. So that prudent approach has to be taken even in times of a crisis, but not just to rush into that. In terms of the process, we also see that effective legislation and policies need proper consultation and dialogue, social dialogue, as pointed out, for instance. And that is why ILO strongly promotes tripartism and social dialogue as essential pillars in the response, in the process of deriving better laws and policies. In most cases, we see it country after country, time and again. There is a rush towards solving problems, trying to solve problems through legislative measures or legal measures, whereas a much more broad-based analytical approach is needed. So all these have a tremendous impact on the fundamental principles and rights at work. I'm not going to go through the list of conventions because it was mentioned already by other speakers. So these principles have been ingrained in the Declaration, Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work Declaration of 1998. And not only that, they have been further emphasized, underscored in Recommendation 205 of 2017 on employment and decent work for peace and resilience, which specifically deals with how member states can respond to crisis or disasters in terms of the world of work. So this brings up the question of commitment of member states, as it is during the crisis times that their resolve is tested most. We know that every country is committed to these principles, but we also need to unpack the word commitment and ask ourselves as to whether that commitment is uniform and embraced by all, or whether it needs further strengthening. So in doing so, a good way is to not just focus on the word rights from fundamental principles and rights at work, but also to focus on the word principles. Because as leaders, as decision makers, what are my principles? If I am a leader, what are my principles that will govern me or my organization to take the right decision? Are the fundamental principles and rights and work.
Insaf, could you please conclude it in a minute?
Yeah, half a minute. So are fundamental principles and rights at work among them? If not, how should we make sure that those principles are inculcated or incorporated into our organizational value system as well as our value system, so that fundamental principles and rights at work become my own principles as a decision maker. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for giving the perspective of the oldest UN agency on the kind of application of laws in times of crisis. Thank you very much. Let me now come to Professor Archana Prasad, who is going to talk about changing labor laws and women in informal employment. Archana Prasad is from the Jawaharlal Nehru University. Come in, please.
Can you hear me?
We can. Please go ahead. Except come closer to the speaker, to the mic. Yeah.
Okay. Is that okay now? Yes. Is it okay?
Yes, it is okay. Please go ahead.
Okay. So first of all, I'd like to thank Professor Jose and Professor Joseph for inviting me here. And it's been a pleasure to listen to the remarks of several people whose work one has read and with whom one has worked in the past also. Now, the topic that was assigned to me was on women in the informal employment and the relationship with changing labor laws. A lot has been said since the morning about the general situation of labor laws and the changes that have taken place in them in the wake of the pandemic and even before that. I'm also grateful to my friend Prabhu and Atul for Ravi for raising certain questions about the notion of social reproduction. and its relationship with the overall cycle of production. I believe that is actually, that link is quite crucial to understanding the status and the position of women workers within the overall political economy. As we know, the women workers, within women and work, 90% of the women workers, or even much more than that, are in fact part of informal employment, and most of their work is invisible. A lot of the examples that I'm going to take are actually going to be from domestic and home-based work, which is where I've been working both practically and even in terms of my academic work. Now, from the women's movement point of view, we have been actually raising 3 demands. The first demand has been really about the recognition of women as workers. So, in fact, the definition of the worker in the law, in the past also, and specifically in the changed codes, actually makes it more difficult for women in informal work to be registered as workers. So we believe that even though the changes in the even though labor laws did not really apply to a multitude of women workers, the space for struggle was there because these laws existed. Now we believe by actually modifying the definition of the worker and narrowing it to a relationship with an establishment or an industry, in fact, will leave out multitude of workers and also reduce the space for the struggle for an overall system for registration of women as workers. Because if they are not registered as workers, then they will not get the benefits that are due to workers, even though you may have the best laws. So the invisibility of women workers is set to increase in the current situation. And I think that it is quite well known that in the post-COVID period, the impact on domestic and home-based workers has been immense. Recently, the All India Democratic Women's Association called for a pan-India survey of domestic and home-based workers. Some of the early results of that have started coming in. And especially in places like Delhi and West Bengal, we are finding that 80 to 90% of the domestic workers have lost their jobs. Of course, if they lose their job, that also means that women within the household, their work increases also, apart from them losing their jobs. So they've lost their jobs. And what is even more instructive, the fact that even their husbands did not earn anything during that period. So it's not merely a question of the recognition of the women's own work, but the crisis of social reproduction is hitting the unpaid work of women or overburdening women workers and their unpaid work in a major way. As far as home-based workers are concerned, we found that almost 100% of the home-based workers in Delhi, and our sample is from different industries, have lost work. Some of them even have payments pending. And I can tell you, in a place like Delhi, in affluent colonies, even domestic workers, 80% of the domestic workers have not got their March payments. Forget April, they've not even got paid for the work that they did while they were in employment. So that's one point. The second thing that I want to say is that even in the revised labor code, the code on wages, the Equal Remuneration Act has been basically reduced to one line, which means that it just says that there should be gender pay parity. The provisions of the Equal Remuneration Act have been not only diluted, they've virtually been thrown out. And the representation of women workers on committees has reduced. So in this situation, when you say that even the most diluted form of the law will not apply, I think the conditions for increased forced labor and unpaid work are set for women workers, especially in a situation where people are desperate for employment. And that brings me to the third point. When we are talking about inspection, I was reading the UP ordinance, and the UP ordinance says that the employers will sort of enter how many workers they've hired on a electronic system, and there's no, so it's like a self-certification and self-inspection that the employers association people were talking about. What does that do? I think that is going to make people hire women workers at much lower wages without actually showing them up to be as workers. Because if you don't have a register, if nobody actually looks at that register, then the conditions of extraction of greater unpaid labor exist. So that's the other thing. Another thing about the extension of working day that I want to really point out is that the UP law, for instance, says that, no, one of the states, I think it's Madhya Pradesh, says that between 7 p.m. and 6 a.m., between 7 p.m. and 6 a.m., you should not employ women workers. Now, even if a woman worker was to work from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. or 7 p.m., that is 12 hours of work, given her other responsibilities, when would her working day start? Her working day would probably start at 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. The point that I'm trying to make is that the way in which the extension of the working day has been done will close employment opportunities for women workers. In any case, we are seeing...
Can you please conclude it in a minute's time?
Yeah, sure. In any case, we are seeing that women's employment is at an all-time, paid women's employment is an all-time low. So the only point that I really want to reiterate is that, in fact, in the post-pandemic period, our fight for both registration for welfare boards as well as should basically be intensified. And thirdly, our struggle for this is going to be impacted by the attacks on the trade unions. So I would like the gender question of work to enter the labor debate in a more prominent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Archana Prasad. We are running short of time. You raised extremely important issues about the signing of conventions by nation states. Their accountability is called into question, but then we live in an ambience where all nations mindlessly disregard their obligations. And it raises broader issues. We'll come back to these issues later on another occasion. Let me call up Dr. Bharat Bhushan to speak about insecure jobs who will protect the migrant workers. Bharat?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
So thank you very much, Dr. Professor Joseph, especially Dr. Isaac Thomas, for calling an interloper like me into an academic conference where I have very little to add. I can't see what my contribution can be. My contribution can only be, I think, a negative contribution, that nothing really works as far as migrant labor is concerned. This COVID-induced lockdown has shown that no one protects the migrant workers. The law doesn't protect them in the best of times. It does not protect them, certainly in times of crisis. The judiciary doesn't protect them. The government doesn't protect them. And even elected representatives don't protect them. They have been Atmanirbhar or self-reliant much before Prime Minister Modi learned to use the term. Let me begin by talking about the laws briefly. So everybody's talked about the laws. I think the laws are toothless, and perhaps they're deliberately toothless. You can pretend to have a framework for protection of migrant workers, but you don't really care, because if you cared, then their wages won't be depressed, their rights would increase, you would have to spend on their welfare, etc. If you take just the 4 big acts, Contract Labor Act, was it used during this crisis? No. It doesn't work because it applies to companies that employ 20 or more workers over 12 months. And overwhelmingly large number of employees in the informal sector, enterprises in the informal sector, remain outside its ambit. Where it's applicable, it's not implementable because of collusion, corruption, lack of state capacity. Another big law, Interstate Migrant Workmen Act. Employers and contractors are meant to be registered, not the workers. And they don't register. That is, the employers and the contractors don't register in most states. So legal entitlements of the channelized workers are also not enforced. This law doesn't protect migrant workers who are directly hired by employers, intrastate agrarian workers, brick kiln workers, plus a host of other category of workers. Most importantly, as I said, it does not require registration of the migrant workers, but only the employers and the supplying contractors. So what purpose it serves, I don't know. Yet another big act, Building and Other Construction Workers Act 1996. Workers are non-unionized, undocumented. They cannot get any benefits unless they have what is called a BOCW card. That is, they have to be certified as construction workers, people who work for 90 days in construction in 1 year. And this certification comes either from unions or from the employers. These workers mostly are seasonal workers, non-unionized. So in fact, a survey in UP showed that 90% workers did not get any benefits from this act. They were outside the ambit, they had no documentation. Yet another big law, Unorganized Sector Workers Social Security Act 2008, which is now sought to be merged into a bigger labor code now by the Social Security Code Bill, except for the construction sector where cess is collected, out of which some, we were told about 39% has been distributed to unemployed workers. There is no provision for generation of resources. It's not clear who will generate resources and how these welfare schemes will work. Where will the money come from? Take the case of domestic workers. Just now, Archana Prasad talked about some aspects of this. They are estimated to be, lower estimates are 40 to 42 lakhs. Now, they are not offered any formal protection under any law, not even in the best of times. They are not recognized as informal workers, but as informal help. Their wages on average are 1/3 of even informal sector workers. They suffer from poor working conditions, exploitation, abuse, and slavery. So despite the intentions that states have, or the state has, about bringing in laws to regulate, monitor, and improve the welfare of migrant workers, and wherever some of these laws exist, as you know, I've not listed all of them, they offer little protection to the informal sector workers. So what do people do? Does the judiciary protect them in any way? These laws are unimplementable, so workers are outside it. They can't even go to the court on these laws. Now, we have seen during this COVID crisis that the Indian judiciary is not a neutral umpire between labor and capital. It is biased against labor. Marxists would say its class character has been amply demonstrated during the COVID crisis. Retired Supreme Court Judge Madan Lokur actually wrote an article where he said the Supreme Court deserves an F grade fail grade for its handling of the migrant crisis. From the start of the COVID-induced crisis on the migrant labor's issue, the Supreme Court has demonstrated time and time again its partisan stance by choosing to believe the lies of the state and being insensitive to the plight of the migrants. On 5 occasions, beginning on March 31st, it has dismissed public interest litigations, public interest applications to help the migrants to mitigate their plight while they were walking back to their villages. At a time when thousands of the workers were walking back to their villages on the roads, on cycles, on rickshaws, on tricycles, disabled workers, the Supreme Court chose to believe the Solicitor General of India, Tushar Mehta, who told the court on 31st March that as of 11 a.m. today, not a single migrant worker was walking. And the Supreme Court judges, I presume, also read newspapers. They also see television. They have the same sources of media as you and I. They chose to believe him. On migrant workers issues, just listen to a sample of Supreme Court statements. Supreme Court says, we will not supplant the wisdom of the government with our wisdom. Then why on earth are you there? If the government is the sole repository of all wisdom, it's doing everything right, Supreme Court cannot question its wisdom. Why have a Supreme Court? And this was on payment of minimum wages to migrant workers during the lockdown. Another statement. A judge asks, how can we stop people from walking? What an idiotic question. Ask yourself, why are they walking in the first place? Whose fault is it? Who faltered? Then we have Chief Justice of India asking, if migrants are being fed and they're in government shelters, why do they need to be paid? Now, if Chief Justice Bobde is given government accommodation and 3 meals a day, would he agree not to take any salary? Would all the Supreme Court judges say, look, we get free food, free housing, therefore no wages need to be paid. So this whole, the idea of why wages are paid is absent from the Supreme Court's wisdom. Why did the Supreme Court finally act? Because it was embarrassed into acting. At least 5 to 6, maybe half a dozen high courts, Karnataka, Andhra, Gujarat, Patna, Madras High Court, they pulled up the local state governments for not doing enough for migrant workers. Lawyers wrote to the Supreme Court. Then suddenly the Supreme Court pretends as if on its own, it's taken a great initiative. It takes so moto notice of migrant workers. Were you sleeping all this while? 3 months later, you take so moto notice and say that we are doing it on our own. And that is when all the workers, majority of them have gone home, reached home, walked home, trudged home somehow. And then you say that the government must pay, the states must pay for their travel. I mean, what a travesty of justice. So after all this, the Supreme Court says, this section of society needs succor and help by the concerned governments. It would seem that Supreme Court was doing little else all along during this crisis, except assisting the executive cover up the tragedy of the migrant workers for which the government was directly responsible. It was not acting as a check on the executive, but assisting, actively supporting the executive in its mismanagement of the crisis. The Supreme Court also did not come to the help of the migrant workers for ensuring their lockdown period wages. More of that in a bit. Siding with the employers against the government order of lockdown wages being mandatorily guaranteed. So Supreme Court doesn't work, laws don't work. Does the government work? Does the government protect migrant workers? This government certainly is not the MyBap of the informal sector workers. It's not of any workers, but certainly not of informal sector workers. So did the government protect migrant workers? I think it's a foolish question, because if it did, there would be no need to activate the judiciary through the PIS. There would be no need for a seminar like this. The government, in fact, lied throughout the crisis and continues to lie even now about the migrant workers. I'll just take 2 instances. One is of lockdown wages. On March 29th, the Home Secretary passed an order assuring lockdown wages under the Disaster Management Act. And the second instance I'll take is of complete lack of anticipation of how the migrant workers would have reacted to the nationwide lockdown. On March 29th, Home Secretary issued an order saying all the employers, be it industry or in shops and commercial establishments, shall make payments of wages of their workers at their workplace on the due date without any deduction for the period their establishments are under closure during the lockdown. Non-compliance, it was pointed out, would be punished. Non-compliance under DM Act Section 551(1) says jail up to 1 year or fine or both. And if non-compliance, that is non-payment of wages in this instance, results in loss of life or imminent danger thereof, then jail for 2 years. In other words, if a worker forced to flee the city for non-payment of wages were to die while walking back or in a train or in a bus, the liability could be fixed. Did the government really want it? It was all for effect, because on May 17th, the March 29th order was rescinded. That means you would think that the wages would still be paid for the period from March 25th to May 17th. Would you be right in assuming that? No. Attorney General tells the Supreme Court when some employers petition the court saying that why are we being paid, forced to pay lockdown wages? He says, look, that order was issued because we didn't want a very big exodus. It was to prevent exodus. It was not suggesting it was not mandatory for employers to pay wages. Now he says, now the government wants to start economic activity. Please keep in abeyance the scrutiny of the March 29th notification for 2 months and let employers and employees reach a settlement in payment of wages under the Industrial Disputes Act. That is, even the guaranteed lockdown period wages have now been made a subject of negotiations, unequal negotiations. Now see the Supreme Court's collusion. Supreme Court says when the employers say, does the government have the right to force us to pay full wages during the lockdowns? Supreme Court says we are also wondering if they have the right, but we will decide on it on June 12th. June 12th was yesterday, and what has the Supreme Court said now? They've given the same order as suggested by the Attorney General, that no coercive action against employers for non-payment of wages, and workers and employers to negotiate how much would be paid or whether it would be paid or not paid. So the government had no intention to protect the wages of the migrant workers right from the beginning. The Supreme Court had no intention to take the government to task for first guaranteeing wages, suggesting there would be punishment if they're not paid, and then withdrawing and leaving it to the workers, leaving the workers at the mercy of employers. The second example of government apathy is non-anticipation of the consequences of this decision. Policymakers should see what would be the consequences. They would do a scenario analysis. If I do A, this would happen. If I do B, something else would happen. They didn't do this because labor was not part of the calculations. If you look at the constitution of the group of ministers that was announced to look after the pandemic, manage the crisis, the labor minister is absent from it. He is nowhere to be seen. They constitute 11 empowered groups to again deal with the pandemic. Not one of them deals with labor or workers directly. Only one group on economic and welfare measures has a labor secretary as a member. These groups were created on March 29th when workers have already started marching back, which means...
Can we...
Just finish. Yet Amit Shah would have everybody believe that the government was extremely sensitive to migrant workers, and they were very clever. It was an astute plan, etc. I won't go into details. Lastly, the legislators also don't protect migrant workers for the simple reason that migrant workers are not a vote bank in their home states. If I am an MLA from Noida in UP, then I don't look at the migrant worker as a working group. I look at them as Biharis, as Bengalis, as ethnic group. So I get represented as a linguistic group, as an ethnic group, as a regional group, but not as a working group, as a migrant worker. Therefore, I conclude by saying that we can keep on talking about improving laws, etc. First, these laws have to work in normal times. Then we have to see whether they'll work in times of crisis. But as of now, nothing and nobody protects migrant workers. Thank you.
Thank you, Bharat, for coming in. It's always a pleasure reading you and now listening to you too, because you are, believe me, one of the most influential, fearless voices of public opinion in India now. let me go to Professor Jimol Unni, colleague from the Center for Development Studies. Jimol is going to speak to us on the concerns of women workers in informal employment. Jimol.
Thank you, Jose, and thank you, Gift, for inviting me. I was in Center for Development Studies like at least 100 years ago, and I'm currently at Ahmedabad University. Just to clarify, I enjoy your warmth calling me from Center for Development Studies. Okay, I think a hell of a lot has already been said about women workers and about informal workers, so I will try to be brief, but you know how economists are. I'll talk about a couple of things about women work. One is working from home, and the second is about the care economy. And then I'll go on to talk about what proactive steps could be taken in the short term, medium term, and in the long term. So we all know that the proportions and so on Radhika has put up. But one of the things I'd like to say is that a very large proportion of like 63 million micro enterprises are home-based, according to the economic census. They undertake all kinds of subcontracting activities at home in traditional and in non-traditional activities. Again, I think Archana was trying to allude to some of these kind of activities. Women are engaged in street vending. There are like 8 million. Of course, the street vending groups say that there are 11 million. Street vendors, a smaller proportion of them are women. Domestic workers, I have estimated at 5 million. Again, there are variations that my estimates are coming out of the PLFS 17-18. Another group of women workers, which is growing particularly in urban areas for some reason, is women working in beauty parlors. It actually shows up in the occupations of women, even in the NSSO. But then again, Radhika was showing you the figures of the informal workers in the formal sector, and that group obviously has been growing in a very, very big way. The problem there is that most of the women who are engaged in these jobs are not in the core jobs of those industries. And with their lower levels of skill and education levels, they tend to get thrown out first. And we had done a small study in Ahmedabad, and we found that they got, more of them got pay cuts than the male employees. So for example, shop assistants in malls. With the fall in demand and the closing of malls, and also a number of industries now saying they can't do face-to-face selling, many of these women are going to lose jobs, besides the fact that there has been a very steep fall in demand. So one of the things which is talked about a lot now, because we urban women are facing it, is this work from home, not just urban women, men as well. But if you look at a reality check on that, like I just said, the economic census said that 36% of enterprises operated from home. In the 2011-12 NSO data, 32% of women are home-based workers. Even in urban areas, 30% of women are home-based workers. If you do a survey of informal sector in cities like Ahmedabad, you just see this very strikingly. So it's not a new phenomenon that people are working from home, except that now it's a different component, a different class, maybe a different educational level of people who are working from home. It can be argued, and it has been argued, that working from home gives flexibility and so on. And from the side of the worker, it's not exactly the best place to work, because if the houses are small, as most of these informal workers would find, it's difficult to actually designate a place of work. And if there are a large number of workers, members in the family, then even more so. Besides all the usual care responsibilities which come onto your head if you happen to be sitting at home, other than what is normally there. From the side of the employer, it seems like a good way to reduce fixed costs. In fact, if you see the new trend of the startups, Bangalore, recently there was this long story about Bangalore startups. Not just startups, even other smaller enterprises have been using this strategy of not hiring space on a regular basis and asking people to work from home. And you can just hire co-working spaces for physical meetings and so on and so forth. And this is obviously at the higher level, slightly higher level of work. In fact, when I was in China many years ago, I noticed that the faculty didn't come into the research institutes on a daily basis. This was basically to avoid congestion in the office and on the public transport. Now, what are the problems arising from this culture of work from home? It's okay as long as there is no discrimination against women and particularly against socially disadvantaged groups. Even in the higher, relatively higher echelons of the labor market, it is possible that when the work from home starts slowly being reduced and people are allowed to come into the office, the discrimination will start if the men and upper castes are allowed to come into the office and women are asked to work from home. It will have something to do with the nature of the work they do, because the nature of the work they do might be lower levels of work which can maybe be handled from home. But this could lead to a subtle kind of an exclusion where a lot of managerial decisions and then later on promotions they get excluded from this. And persons working from home, it's much easier to accuse them of shirking because you can't fully monitor their activities. You have in different sectors have different problems with regard to working from home. In the education sector like ours, and it's coming out in the open now, for schools and colleges who have started taking classes from home. Both for the teachers and for the students, this is a problem because of the basic problem of digital divide in the country. So that students from poor households not having a smartphone, not having a laptop, or only just having one which generally belongs to the parents or elder siblings are unable to access. We had this case in Kerala. I mean, people all are aware of that, of you're going on TV and then you know what happened. It was a very sad case. Internet connectivity can be poor. We've seen it in our famous webinar as well. And data charges are extremely high. When our university went online, because we did it almost immediately as soon as we closed, as soon as lockdown happened, the children and the faculty are having to pay huge amounts of money for sitting in a class, data charges for sitting in a class for 1.5 hours. And then if they have to do it all day, data charges are a big problem. Now, we also have the gig economy, the e-commerce, and all kinds of services going online. You're definitely going to see more of this going online. And the Zoom, which we had hardly heard of, is now used for all kinds of activities, including socializing. In the gig economy, has a whole series of problems which have been brought out by various people, particularly from the ILO has brought out a number of reports on this. Because the problems of regulation of such work, discrimination, harassment, lack of bargaining power, is all part of working from home at various levels. The governments have not yet moved to regulate such work. The platforms themselves are trying to regulate the work. Now, when working from home, which like I said already existed for 30% of the women, if more men and women are going to be working from home, is there any method to regulate them as far as you're talking about laws? Is there anything that's recognizing the fact that more and more people might actually be at home? And then how do you take care of discrimination? How do you take care of harassment within the home as well? There's a lot of literature now coming out on violence in the house. The next topic I'd like to talk about is care economy, which is again very closely related to this working from home. Now this working from home with no help available, also keeping children at home has hit home in the sense that people have begun to recognize that this is one hell of a lot of work. It's not the short period of staying at home is not going to change the patriarchal structures of society. It's not that because everybody is now staying at home, they're going to be sharing the work. It's going to take a long time before this whole work allocation, what our earlier speakers were calling the social reproduction of labor, moves away or is shared by men and women equally. At the level of the economy, official statistics only take care of paid work and remunerated work, including self-employed work, which produces an income. Unpaid care, and there's a lot of literature and a lot of feminist economists have been arguing for unpaid work being counted and being monetized and so on and so forth. Now, the system of national accounts, even in 1993, had decided on a method, of collecting care work and information on other work done by women and others in satellite accounts. That is, you can compute the work and the incomes that these workers are contributing, but not include them in the GDP for various reasons. Because if you monetize that, then it changes the cash flows and so on and so forth, other reasons given to us. a few countries. How many countries really do this? I'm sure India doesn't do it. Now, time use survey is one of the first steps towards it. We did one in the 90s, and now recently the NSO has just completed a time use survey, but we've not seen the data. I happen to be the that subcommittee of the Standing Committee on Economic Statistics. I happen to be the chair, but the time use survey has not come in because the PLF is on the front burner. And it's unlikely care work, women's work, work from home is hardly going to become the priority of the government, given the fact that they can hardly take care of the public health systems, they can hardly control the private health systems in the face of this crisis. I'll just conclude with a couple of proactive measures that we can take in the short run and in the long run. This whole pandemic and this crisis is going to trigger some kind of large-scale restructuring of economic activities, and it's still not clear what kind of activities are going to shut down or going to become a lot less. Like, for example, the hotel industry, the restaurant industry, street vending in food, and so on and so forth. Women are part of the overall labor force, and they are definitely going to be affected by this. And as I was trying to explain earlier, they're likely to be thrown out first in any case. So the first thing is to bridge the digital divide. And this requires a number of things. To begin with, nationwide internet connectivity, because if it is not there in rural towns, rural areas and small towns, they'll be left behind. Next important thing is affordable smartphones, tablets, or laptops. If that's not there, then the women and the young are likely to be left behind. And the third one is affordable cards, like I explained, and broadband affordable. If not, the poor are left behind. So in this whole process,
Jimal, can we conclude?
Sure. In the medium term, upgrading of skills is a major issue, and actually mapping of skills. So to put it very, very briefly, there are many efforts now being made to map the skills of workers digitally. The most famous one is TeamLease in Bangalore, but then we have such efforts in Gurgaon, Delhi, Ahmedabad, and so on. This includes informal workers and to list the skills that they have. And on the other side, we attempted this in Ahmedabad with a particular company to digitalize the demand of skill requirements of the industry. The idea is then you have an idea of what are the skills available to workers, and if it is digitalized, it can also be tracked as to where these workers are. And then one can think of the next step, which is really to think in terms of the skills which are missing and training for these and so on and so forth. This is obviously a medium-term plan, and unless and until women work is also included in that, it doesn't work. So macro estimates are great to help planning of budgets and allocation of resources. But for the revival of the economy, micro-level planning is absolutely essential to visualize what can be done in the short run and in the medium term to galvanize the workers and enterprises. Thank you.
Thank you, Jimu. We are really running short of time. Therefore, let me straight away proceed to Dr. Amit Bazole from the Asim Premji University. Amit Bazole. Amit Bazole doesn't seem to be there. Hello? He doesn't seem to be there. Can you hear me?
Amit Bazole illa sir.
Okay, that's good. Thank you. Then we proceed to Nagaraj, and thereafter the last speaker, that is Dr. Anamitra Chowdhury, and onward to Dr. Nagaraj. Thank you, Nagaraj, for coming in. Nagaraj, can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
We can hear you if it is Nagaraj. Yes.
Yeah, I can hear you. Okay. Can you see me?
Then go ahead.
Okay. Okay. Fine. Okay. Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the invitation. I thank Gulati. So, yeah, I start with some very basic, at the risk of repeating. What is organized sector as per Indian laws? government in its widest definition, private corporate sector, factory sector, registered educational and medical institutions receiving grant and aid. This sector employs 8 to 10% of India's workers. And how are the wages and working conditions decided? It's a every 10 years there's a central pay commission based and the negotiations are based on a principle of fair wage, and the government should be a model employer. I mean, that's the underlying principle behind the wage commission's negotiations. Once it is decided for the central government employees, by some pro rata basis, the same principle and same wage structure gets transferred to almost the entire public sector in due course of time. It does not mean that all the public sector workers get the same scales, but they do get something proportionate. Factory sector wages are based on negotiations between management and workers' unions. Earlier days, when the tripartism was dominant in the 50s and 60s, the government played an important role in wage negotiations. Today, wage boards for the organized sector by industry have practically been eliminated. There are very few wage boards left. So therefore, it is entirely factory or a company-specific negotiations which take place. And the proportion of workers unionized has come down. In my view, it's between 20 to 30% of the workers are unionized. Therefore, the workers are at an enormously disadvantageous situation in negotiating with the employers. Regulation of organized sector. This is the very contentious issue, which is the heart of the recent debate. Reportedly, there are 27 central and 200 state laws that govern the organized sector labor. So these are stark numbers which are often thrown at in public discourse. Hence, it is often said India's labor market is turned very rigid, making labor a fixed cost. And this is a standard argument the employers put forward. Labor is no more a variable cost, as in our simple economics textbook examples, but labor has become a fixed cost. Result, what has happened? It leads to substitution of capital for labor, and hence the employment growth is poor. The factories remain small because the employers don't want to increase scale of production for the fear of agglomerating a lot of workers, and hence lose out on economies of scale, and hence miss out on productivity gains in large-scale production. Work, therefore, gets outsourced to informal sector where labor laws practically don't apply. I mean, Professor Bhadre used the Reserve Army labor, which I've been using the word called, we have a surplus labor. If you look at it in Lewisian way, you have a huge surplus labor, which is there in the unorganized sector. So whenever the wage pressure increases in the organized sector, the work gets farmed out to the unorganized sector. Yeah, that's how the wages are kept under check. Okay. So as the organized sector labor laws are considered very rigid, there is a appeal. I mean, there is a wide argument for repealing these laws or diluting them or rationalizing the labor laws. And this is the essence behind what the UP government did recently. I mean, this is the most recent, most brazen way of doing it, but that's the most recent example of it before us. Evidence of what the labor laws were. True, there are too many laws and rationalization needed, and that's something which I would personally agree with. I mean, very few countries in the world have as complicated labor laws as we have. So there is, if you say rationalization required, I am all for it. But the question arises: do so many laws fortify the labor's interest, or do they create enough loopholes for employers to exploit the routes? As we all know, labor laws are stringent on paper, and poor enforcement is something which the audience who here would know it. Okay, labor courts work very poorly. Employers with deep pockets have an upper hand. Okay. Surplus labor in the informal sector and fragmentation of union movement weaken the bargaining power of the organized labor. This again, we know that unions are divided by parties. Interesting. If you go to any factory today, and it will be interesting to take a photograph, there will be at least 10 labor union notices, which shows how many labor unions are operating in that factory. So it really shows how fragmented the labor movement is today. Okay. I will just want to bring out two sets of facts to show how weak these labor laws are. Though on paper we have so many of them, okay, an employer would say that we have one of the most rigid labor laws, but basics are very poor. I mean, here I pick up two telling examples. This one is about registration under the Factories Act. Just to remind, if any factory employs 10 workers using power, it has to get registered under the Factories Act. This is the cornerstone of entire labor regulation in India. Okay, but we all know that factories registration is very widely violated. Okay. So here is a when you put numbers, it makes sense. Here are the numbers. If you compare the number of establishments in manufacturing which should have been registered under the Factories Act but don't get registered, and you see that number, that proportion was 52% in 1980 and goes up to 66% in 2013-14. It really shows, which means that 2/3 of factories in India, which ought to have been registered in the Factories Act by the fact that they employ 10 or more workers, do not get registered under the Act. And this proportion has been rising steadily, which really shows the meaninglessness of these labor laws. Yet they are considered to be the most rigid labor laws in India. Therefore, I just wanted to flag this particular statistic to show that labor tendency argument simply doesn't hold water. The basic cornerstone of labor law edifice we have is so poorly implemented. Okay, so where is the stringency of the law? That's the question I end this slide with. Okay, I have one last slide I have is about the distribution of productivity gains. So if the labor laws are so rigid as it is claimed by employers and their bureaucratic supporters, okay, one would have thought that the workers are able to grab a growing share of the output or value added, which means that their share in value added should be growing. Okay, I mean, this is a basic simple economic idea. Okay, but when you plot the data for the organized manufacturing for 4 decades, starting from 73-74 to 2013-14, what do you find? And this is the best possible data we have from the ASI. You find that practically there's no growth in real wages per worker for the entire 4 decades. And you find most of the productivity gains have been cornered by the employers. So this is a completely unequal bargaining situation where all the gains of productivity are accruing to the capital, not to workers. So if the labor laws are so rigid in the organized sector as it is often made out to be, then the graphs would not look like this. And these graphs are for 4 decades, so they cannot be easily faulted. So my submission is the whole argument of rigid labor laws are holding back productivity growth or employment or industrial growth and exports, I think simply doesn't hold true. Okay, I stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for making those wonderful points. All the same, I was sort of looking forward to listening to your making the other important point that the entire regulatory frame is being tilted in favor of the corporate sector, who are increasingly being exempted from the purview of legislation. We'll have another opportunity to listen to you. Since we are running short of time, let me request Anamitra Roy Chaudhary is the last speaker on our list. Thank you very much, Dr. Anamitra. Anamitra, yeah, he has got Yes, got slides, don't worry. And hello, can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Please go ahead.
Okay.
Dr. Anamitra, we are running short of time. Go ahead, please.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me in this seminar. So what I'm going to do is basically to put forward a statement hypothesis is that can the wages code actually be read as a cost-saving device? Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Impulse for cost reduction was also. The previous slide, please. Okay, so let me just stay on this. Basically saying that the impulse for cost reduction was already there, and this was done primarily through the contract workers. And what we find is that the contract workers currently is around 1/3 of what in the organized manufacturing sector. Now, how this is reducing the cost can be seen from the current slide, this slide, which is basically the share of contract workers' wages to total workers' wages. Now, so therefore, what we find is that in the mid-80s, the share of wages were around 25%. Now it is around half. The wage cost. This remains. How? Because although in the occupational safety code, the threshold for contract workers has remained to be unchanged, which is 20 workers, but now you can actually ask for a work specific license. So even if you do not get a full license, still you can use a work specific license, which is now permitted, proposed to be permitted, and therefore this route remains open. However, what I'm going to argue is that the wages code, can we go to the next slide, please? Yeah. So the wage code actually institutionalizes multiple strategies of cost reduction. So this can be analytically divided into two parts. One in principle, the second is in practice. So first in principle. Working day, which is 8 hours, I think it has been said, has been increased to 9 hours. And currently many states have done it's increased to now 12 hours. So what is done in this case is that the overtime rates, the wages code say, is twice the normal day wage. If you increase the normal day, what is normal day, if you increase that, therefore automatically what happens is that you do not have to pay the overtime and have to pay the normal day's wage. Therefore, this helps in reaping the absolute surplus value. And as you can see from the table, is that this is from TLFS, is that regular wage workers everywhere, irrespective of gender, was working more than 48 hours a week, which is 8 hours a day. And therefore, they were eligible for overtime. Now they will not get overtime. For casual workers, although they work for less than 48 hours, but remember that their job is also intermittent. So every day in a week, they might not be getting job, and therefore in a particular day, they might be working for more than 8 hours. They will also not get the benefit of overtime. But this has also an impact on employment. How? Consider that that the total labor requirement, suppose, is 72 hours. If you have 8 hours a day, you require 9 workers. On the other hand, if you have 9 hours, what is a normal working day, which has been extended, you require then 8 workers. Therefore, straight away, you reduce the number of jobs. Can we go to the next slide, please? Now note that the fixing of minimum wages. What has been purposely introduced is the floor wage, where for no methodology has been stated how the floor wage will be estimated. I think it has been pointed out is that the minimum wage for 2018 was 375, the floor wage was 176, less than half. However, interestingly, the floor wage is the reference point for states. They can't go down below the floor wage. Therefore, for states who are competing for investment, this is going to lead to a race to the bottom. And this has in fact been implicitly accepted because the floor wage is actually the unreachable threshold. Next, consider the fixing of minimum wages. Scheduled employment has been removed. Therefore, industry level minimum wages has also been removed. Therefore, it is unclear if in the bricklaying industry, minimum wages will be same as that of the automobile workshop industry. If this is the case, then there is a possibility that the wages will be tethered to the lowest common denominator, which again would lead to wage compression. Now consider about the wage differential. Wage has to be differentiated now according to skills and arduousness of work. However, arduousness has not been defined in the code. Also note that the skill itself is a subjective criteria and their ambiguity exists. For example, in the list where different skills are listed, skilled, unskilled, semi-skilled, highly skilled, and so on, driller is one job occupation which occurs both in unskilled, semi-skilled, and skilled, which can't happen. And the other thing is that this is nothing new. For example, in the earlier provision, it was also the case that different class of workers could actually get different wages. So this is not something new. Now let us go to the bonus. The eligibility of bonus is now 20 and more workers. Earlier also this was the criteria. However, under certain conditions, it was the case that 10 or more workers were eligible to get bonus. This has been removed. The standing committee actually recommended this, the threshold to be 10 or more workers. It has been rejected. Can we go to the next slide, please? So this was in principle, so cost compression in principle, and now we come to the next thing, which is cost compression in practice. Now we know, as it has been pointed out by Professor Nagraj also, that there is a difference between law in the book and what is translated in the in actual life. What we find is that inspection, I think everybody knows it, the surprise checks are not allowed, which violates ILO convention. Web-based inspection has also been now allowed, and inspector cum facilitator, now that's the new term. Even if they find out that there is some kind of a breach of law which has happened in a particular unit, they can't simply go and inspect it because this has to be assigned to them. And they are assigned to random draw of units, and given the very low number of inspectors, normally it is the case that in 3 and 5 years span of a farm comes. Also, for penalty for violation, earlier if you violated the minimum wage, it would lead to straightaway imprisonment. Now it has been, for the first breach, if you are caught, it has been transformed into 50,000 as the fine, and for other violations, say for not keeping records, on the first opportunity, employer is guided by the inspector cum facilitator without any penalty, and that the inspector facilitates him to, in case of if there is a failure, the employer actually is going to pay a fine to the tune of 10,000 to 20,000. Standing committee actually recommended this to be 50,000 to 10 lakhs. However, this has been rejected. Can we go to the last slide, please? This has already been pointed out by Professor Nagraj, is that so what we find by it simply consolidates surplus extraction. So the blue line is basically the product wage, and the green line is the labor productivity index. What we find that from the early 90s, these gaps are increasing, and it seems to be the case, as Professor Bhaduri also pointed out, that the state actually works as an umpire, and it's solidly in favor of capital. I think all the idea about changing these labor laws is basically to consolidate this gap, in fact, to increase these gaps. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Anamitra Roy Chowdhury, for bringing again extremely important issues about the movement of productivity and real wages, and the kind of discriminatory treatment now being meted out to labor, and the kind of new regulations that are undermining the entire edifice of labor regulations that existed in this country. We have brought them out through these wonderful figures. Thank you very much. And I must apologize to all the panelists here. We were trying to press in too many issues into a very limited time period. And there are far too many complex issues which require more than 10 minutes presentation. And indeed, we were trying to compress you all into the gap of just 3 hours. That in itself is too long. But then the fact remains, our interest was getting all of you together on one forum, explaining different facets of change taking place in India and its implications for the poorest of the poor in the world of work. Thank you very much for all those extremely fascinating presentations. And this is not the time to summarize the discussions, because we have got yet another session to take place. That is the concluding session, wherein a lot of people, participants who had come in earlier, are meant to be here. So we'll take a 5 minutes break before we go into the next session. Let me say thank you very much to all of you, one by one. Let me thank you. But then I would like to name all people who came in and responded to our summons and our requests, and indeed grateful to them. Let me repeat this request. We will be sending you transcripts, and we would like these presentations to be written up, corrected by you, so that we can publish them in a volume, in sort of a volume, presenting all the papers. That will be done very soon. As soon as we have the transcript ready, we'll be sending them to you, and I trust we have your permission for proceeding with the papers you would be sending us in. And let me again take this opportunity to thank all of you for taking part in this exposition, because there was no dialogue, but then the exposition, the presentations were extremely insightful, and they will help us digest the magnitude of changes that are taking place in India. And it was an immense learning opportunity for all of us who took part in this particular exercise. And thank you one and all for coming into this webinar. Thank you very much.